The moon was full and merciless. Seraphine Cole stood at the edge of the clearing where the bonfire threw orange light across 200 faces, and she told herself to breathe. Just breathe. She had known this night was coming for 3 years. She had prepared for it the way she prepared for everything, quietly, methodically, with her hands busy and her face still. Not because she was unfeeling, because some things were too important to perform. She smoothed the front of her gray dress. She had made it herself the previous autumn, cut from good wool, hemmed straight by lamplight over 3 evenings. It was not beautiful. It was not meant to be beautiful. It was meant to last. And it would. The clearing was the old gathering ground at the heart of Blackthorn territory, ringed by pine trees so ancient their roots had grown down into the earth like fingers tightening a grip over centuries. The pack had been assembling since sunset, families together in clusters, the elders settled in their carved wooden chairs near the fire pit, the younger wolves pressing close to the front where they could see and be seen. Torchlight moved across the faces of people she had known her whole life, faces that had handed herbs through cottage windows and called her mother's name across the market square, faces that had taken her knowledge and returned her polite distance and nothing more. She stood at the edge because the edge was where she had always stood. Her mother had offered to come with her. Nora Cole had said it that morning while they were both in the kitchen, her hands occupied, not looking at Seraphine, just releasing the words into the air between them. "I'll stand with you if you want." Seraphine had said no. Not because she wanted to be alone, and not to prove anything to the clearing or to the pack or to herself. She had said no because this moment, whatever it turned out to be, was hers to stand in by herself. Some things could only be walked through alone, and trying to share them reduced them in ways that were harder than the original difficulty. She had arrived at the gathering ground early. That too was intentional. She had wanted the time to watch the clearing fill, to stand in the growing crowd and let herself become steady inside it before the drums began. She had used the time well. By the time the last family settled into its place and the elders had taken their chairs and the fire had been built to its proper height, she had been standing for 30 minutes in the cold air, and she had found the particular kind of stillness that was hers. Not peace, not resignation, not readiness in any martial sense, but the settled certainty of someone who has thought a thing through completely, and has arrived at the only honest position available. Dorian Blackthorn walked into the clearing at exactly the moment the drums started. He was wearing his ceremonial colors, dark blue with silver threading at the collar, and someone had dressed his hair. He walked the way he always walked, with the easy, unquestioned confidence of a person who has never entered a room and wondered what the room thought of him, who has never had cause to wonder, who expects the room to be glad of his arrival as a simple matter of fact. She had watched him walk into rooms for 6 years. She knew the walk. She had never found it easy to dislike, which was one of the more complicated things about her specific situation. He did not look at her when he entered. She noted this without surprise and without judgment, because the absence of surprise was the thing she had been working toward. The elder Hilda rose from her chair. Hilda was a woman who appeared to have been carved from the same material as the old pine trees behind her, weathered to a particular density, slow to move and impossible to shift once positioned. She raised one hand and the drums stopped. The gathered pack went quiet with the particular completeness of people who have practiced collective silence until it becomes easy. Hilda spoke the old words. The ceremony of declaration had not changed in 300 years, and would not change tonight. She called the name of the pack, called the names of the moon phases since the last gathering, called the names of the newly bonded pairs who had come forward in the months between this gathering and the last. Each name landed in the silence like something placed with care. Each one mattered. That was the point of saying them aloud in public, to confirm that they mattered, to make the pack the witness. Then she called Dorian Blackthorn forward. He walked to the center of the clearing with his shoulders back and his chin level, stood before the fire, and turned to face the assembled pack. He was comfortable. He looked entirely, perfectly comfortable. Even here, even now. Seraphine thought, this is the part where I walk forward. She walked forward. The path from the edge to the center of the clearing was perhaps 30 feet. She had measured it once as a child, running between the pine ring and the fire pit on some errand for her mother, counting her steps. 30 feet was nothing. 30 feet was a very long distance when 200 wolves were watching you cross it in silence with no drums and no fire sound except the crackle of the logs and the quiet that was heavier than any sound would have been. She kept her spine straight. She kept her hands at her sides, still. She did not look at the faces as she passed them because she did not need their expressions and did not want to sort through what she might find in them. She was simply moving from one place to another, deliberately, with the dignity of a person who has nothing to prove to this clearing or to anyone standing in it. She reached the center and stood across from Dorian Blackthorne and looked at him directly. He looked back. His expression was the blankest she had ever seen on a living face. Not cruel, not cold in the way of anger, simply absent. It was the face of a man who had already finished with this, who was here to execute a conclusion he had already reached, who was doing what was procedurally required, and not one thing more. The bond between them was real. She had felt it at 16. A quiet, insistent thread, like a root that had found water, and was not letting go no matter what the surface weather did. She had spent 6 years being entirely practical about the bond. Feeling it did not mean she was owed anything by it. Choosing it was his right as much as hers, and withholding that choice was his right equally. She had accepted this. She had prepared for this. She was standing in the center of the clearing having prepared for this, and she was going to be exactly as fine as she had decided she was going to be. Hilda said, "Dorian Blackthorne, do you acknowledge the bond?" He said, "I acknowledge it." Hilda said, "Do you receive it?" One of the pine logs in the fire shifted and sent a column of sparks up into the dark above the clearing. The sparks rose in a brief bright stream, then went out. The silence held for another second. Dorian said, "I decline it." 2 words. The clearing did not gasp. That was the first thing she registered, that no one was surprised, which meant the pack had already known, or had assumed, or had discussed it in the weeks and months before this night, and had arrived here tonight already carrying the expectation. The sound that moved through the 200 wolves was not shock. It was something quieter and more particular, the collective exhale of people who have been holding an anticipation and are now releasing it, a small, collective settling. She understood, in the first 5 seconds after those 2 words fell into the clearing, that she had not been the only one waiting for this night. She had been the only one who did not know that everyone was waiting. Hilda's face remained entirely composed. She had seen everything in 30 years of presiding. She had made peace with all outcomes. Dorian had already turned slightly away, not from Seraphine exactly, but away from the direct line of the exchange, toward the fire, toward whatever came next, as if this were already administrative history. Seraphine stood in the center of the clearing and she did not cry. She had made this decision in advance, not in a dramatic moment, not in the days before the ceremony, but gradually, over the years, settling into it the way you settle into a position that is correct. The center of this clearing, the fire of this ceremony, the 200 faces of this pack did not deserve her tears. What she felt was hers. It was not theirs. They had not earned it and she was not going to give it. She kept her face still. She did the harder thing, which was keeping it still without making it a wall. She kept it open, honest, present, not flinching and not performing the not flinching. Hilda turned to her. Her voice had something in it that lived in the space between pity and respect without being either one. "Seraphine Cole, the bond is declined. You are released from it by the law of the pack. You go forward unbound." Unbound. She had always been unbound. She had been the keeper's daughter at the South Edge for 22 years. She had walked the path in rain, frost, and the green of summer. She had brought compounds to Marjorie's knee every winter, and fever medicine to children whose parents called her mother first and then, because the need was specific and the need was real, called her. She had been unbound in every way that had ever mattered. This ceremony had done nothing except make it official in front of 200 people who had already known it. She nodded to Hilda. She turned. She began walking back to the edge. She had taken 4 steps when the laughter started. Not loud. Designed not to be loud. Designed to be precisely heard without appearing to be aimed. Rippling through the younger cluster near the front of the clearing. Quick and low and carefully cut off by someone making the gesture of stopping it while making absolutely certain it had already been delivered. She recognized 2 of the voices. She did not look at them. She kept walking. Near the elder chairs, a low comment and then a response. The single word she caught in the response was naturally. Just the one word. Naturally. She reached the edge of the clearing. She stopped there, where the torchlight gave out and the pines began, and she stood for a moment looking back at the fire across 30 feet of ground. The drums were beginning again. The ceremony was moving to its next phase, the part that had nothing to do with her. The pack's collective attention was already shifting. She was registering everything with a strange, clean precision. The cold in the grass at her ankles where the afternoon rain had not yet dried, the smell of wood smoke and pine resin and cold air, the particular way the fire threw its light upward at angles that made familiar faces look carved and ancient. Her mind did this in difficult moments, catalogued, sorted, held things at the measured distance of the examined rather than the felt. It was in that cataloging stillness that she became aware of something standing at the tree line to her left. She turned. He was positioned in the gap between two large pines, precisely at the seam where the torchlight ended and the dark of the forest began, standing in that seam as if he had chosen it deliberately, as if the line between seen and unseen was exactly where he intended to be. Dark clothing, tall, and still, not the stillness of waiting but the stillness of complete, focused attention, a man who had chosen to be exactly where he was, and to give his full self to being there. She did not know his face. She knew his sigil. Everyone in the Pact territories knew the king's household mark, the mountain pine above the crescent, black on gray, worn at the shoulder of the household guard. She had seen it on supply riders, on official documents, on the livery of the king's messengers passing through the valley twice a year. She had never seen it standing in the tree line at the edge of a declaration ceremony, watching. She looked at him. He looked back. His eyes were gray. She could determine this even at this distance and in this combination of torchlight and moonlight, which she filed away without yet understanding why it mattered. His face was not performing any expression she could easily name. He was watching the ceremony the way you watch a fire, with full attention and without any visible stake in the outcome. But his gaze was not on the ceremony. It was on her. She held it for 3 seconds, long enough to be certain of what she was seeing, not long enough to make it into something she was constructing. Then she turned back to the clearing, because the drums had shifted in the way that meant Hilda was speaking again, and she was not going to stand in the dark between the trees trying to understand something for which she did not yet have enough information. She was going home. She walked into the south path and the dark between the pines swallowed her, and behind her the ceremony continued, the drums and the voices and the fire, all of it continuing without her, as it would have to and as it should. She listened to the sounds fade behind her as the path curved away and the trees grew close and the moonlight came through the branches in broken pieces that moved with the wind. She walked at her own pace, no faster, no slower. She knew every route on this path, every bend, every place where the ground softened near the stream. She had walked it her whole life, and she could walk it without watching her feet, and tonight she was grateful for that, because her attention was not entirely with her feet. She was thinking about the date on a document that had not yet been placed under her mat, but that she was, without fully knowing why, already certain existed. The cottage lamp was on. Her mother had left it burning. She opened the door, chamomile on the grate, her mother's shawl over the good chair, the fire low and steady. The cottage smelled of exactly what it had always smelled of, and would always smell of, and she stood in the doorway with the cold at her back and breathed it. She sat on the floor beside the fire in her good gray dress and her coat, and she sat there for a long time, and the tea went cold and she drank it anyway, and the owl called once from the south pines, and the river ran, and the fire settled into itself. She thought about the gray eyes in a different way than she had been thinking about them, not as an anomaly to be catalogued, not as a piece of information to be held at arm's length until she had more to go on, but as a direction. This was new. She had been thinking about them as a fact to be stored. She was now thinking about them as a direction, and the difference between those two things was the difference between knowing where something is and knowing where it is going. She thought, I have spent 6 years carrying a bond that ran in one direction and deposited itself in a person who had already written the conclusion before standing publicly to state it. She thought, that is not what a direction is supposed to be. A direction was supposed to run towards something that ran back. That was the function. She had always known this intellectually, had understood it the way she understood things she had learned from her mother's teaching, rather than from experience, which was to say correctly but without the specific weight that experience adds to correct understanding. She thought about standing at the edge of the clearing after those 2 words and looking at the tree line and finding gray eyes looking back, not at the center of the clearing, at the edge. She thought, he was watching where I was, not where the ceremony was. She thought, that is a different thing. She thought, I should stop thinking about it until I have more information. She thought, I have very little ability to stop thinking about it. She pulled her coat tighter and looked at the fire and thought about the bond she had carried for 6 years, and whether it was what she had thought it was or whether it had been, all along, not a destination but a way of practicing for one. The way she had kept the compound kit for 12 years and the kit had been the preparation and the Blackthorn compound work was what the preparation was for, not because anyone had planned it this way, but because useful things compound over time the way her mother had said they did. She thought, I am reaching for a metaphor in the middle of the night. She thought, this is what thinking looks like when it has nothing left to do. She went to bed. She thought about the gray eyes in the tree line. She thought, that was the king. She thought he was watching all of it, and the direction he was watching was not toward the center of the clearing. She thought, I don't know what to do with that yet. She put it down in the place she kept things she was not ready to understand. Not discarding it, holding it carefully until she had enough information to understand it properly. She got up, she rinsed the cold cup, she took off her coat. She went to bed. She slept. Not well, not badly, enough to be ready for the morning. She found it in the morning, under the mat at the front step. Not hidden, not thrown. Placed with deliberateness, the deliberateness of someone who has made a decision and followed through on it precisely, and without second guessing. A folded square of thick pack paper, sealed with blackthorn wax, her name written across the front in the confident hand of someone who had never in their life hesitated over their own penmanship. She stood on the front step with the morning cold coming off the river, and looked at her name in Dorian Blackthorn's handwriting, and she thought, he wrote this before last night. She did not know it yet as a fact, but she thought it with the particular quality of certainty that comes when a pattern completes itself. She took it inside. The goats could wait another hour. They would be annoyed. The goats were always annoyed. They would survive. She sat at the kitchen table still in her rough sleep wool with her hair loose and her hands flat on the table on either side of the letter, as if steadying something that was not in any danger of moving. The morning light was thin and gray through the kitchen window. The fire had burned to embers and she had not yet added wood. She was cold. She noticed she was cold and did not do anything about it, because the cold was not the thing that needed her attention right now. She broke the seal. 1 page. He had used the good pack paper, the heavy kind with the blackthorn watermark pressed into the fiber, the kind reserved for formal correspondence between ranked members of the pack hierarchy. Not a note, not a message, a document, the kind of thing you produced when you wanted a record of having said the thing correctly. The date at the top was 3 days ago. 3 days ago. She read the letter once, slowly, all the way through. Then she set it down and looked at the far wall, where her mother's dried herb bundles hung in their organized rows: yarrow, comfrey, dog rose, calendula, elder, all familiar and reasonable and grounded in the simple logic of what each one was for and what each one did. She read it again. The language was formal in the specific way that language becomes when someone has anticipated every possible response and preempted it. Every sentence covered its angle. Every statement was technically correct and was shaped precisely to be technically correct in a way that could not be argued with, even if it could be argued around. He had declined the bond. He had cited incompatibility of station. He had wished her well in phrases so precise and so empty that they were almost an achievement of a particular kind, the achievement of having said nothing while appearing to have said something considerate. He had dated it 3 days ago. She was thinking about the date. She was thinking about what it meant to have this document ready and sealed and set aside. Waiting. She was thinking about the quality of the wax seal and the weight of the paper and the certainty of the penmanship, and she was understanding, piece by piece, what last night had actually been. It had not been a decision. It had been the announcement of a decision, and the decision itself had been made 3 days ago, alone, at a desk, with a stick of sealing wax and the good paper, and then filed carefully until the appropriate public moment to execute it. She had stood in the center of the clearing. She had held her spine straight and her face still and her hands quiet, and she had done all of that in front of 200 people, in a ceremony that from Dorian Blackthorn's perspective had been the formal, public execution of paperwork he had already completed days before. She put the letter down on the table. She got up and added wood to the fire and set water to boil and put on her work boots and went out to milk the goats. The morning was very cold. The goats were indeed annoyed. She worked with her hands in the familiar motions that did not require her attention, which left her attention free to follow the thought she was following to its end. He could have told her, that was the thought. She was not asking for an elaborate conversation, not asking for weeks of preparation or careful staging. She was asking for the simple thing, a person who had made a decision affecting someone else, going to that someone and saying so before the public announcement. The south path ran past her cottage. He rode it twice a week. He could have knocked on the door where her name was painted in her mother's letters and said, "I need to tell you something before the gathering." He had not done that. He had written the letter, dated it, sealed it, kept it, executed the ceremony, and placed the letter under her mat in the dark after she was already walking home through the trees. She understood him now better than she ever had, and what she understood was that this had not been cruelty. Cruelty required more engagement. Cruelty cared enough about the other person to want them to hurt. This was something smaller and more final than cruelty. It was administration. She had been a matter he had resolved and documented according to the correct procedure. She finished the milking and went inside and washed her hands 3 times and stood at the window with the tea steeping. The south path was clear in the morning mist. The river was low and silver. Two finches worked through the bramble near the gatepost. The world was going about its business with complete indifference to the letter on the kitchen table. She turned and picked up the letter. She did not want it in the cottage. She did not want it on the table when her mother came downstairs. Nora Cole had her own feelings about last night. She carried them deep and quiet the way she carried everything that mattered to her, but they were there, and the sight of blackthorn wax at the breakfast table was not something Seraphine was going to put in her mother's morning. She folded it along its original creases. She walked to the fire, which was starting to catch properly now and putting out heat. She held the letter over the grate. The paper warmed in her hand. The wax seal softened at its edges. She let it go. It caught faster than she had expected. The quality of the paper, the weight of it, something in the sizing of the fiber. It took and went orange and curled and collapsed to ash at the bottom of the grate in less time than it had taken her to read it. She watched the last of it go. She thought, I will remember the date. Whatever else leaves me, I will keep the date. She went back to the table and drank her tea. She had just finished and was rinsing the cup when she heard it, the rhythm of more than one person on the south path, moving with intention. She had spent 22 years at the territory's edge, and she could read the path the way she read her reference journal, quickly, accurately, without needing to think about it. This was a small group, moving at a steady pace with purpose, and underneath it, a sound she placed after a moment. Hooves, multiple horses, more than two. She stepped to the kitchen window. 4 horses came around the bend in the path, riders in dark traveling gear with the King's Mountain Pine sigil at the shoulder. Behind them, 2 more horses pulling a small supply cart with the same sigil on its oilcloth cover, and behind the cart 2 more riders closing the formation. She thought, that is the King's household guard. She thought, they are stopping at my gate. One rider broke from the group and came up the path to the cottage door and knocked. She went to the door. He was young, younger than she had expected, with the careful posture of someone new to formal duty, and a face that was working very hard at official, and not quite landing on it, because earnestness kept breaking through. He said, Seraphine Cole? She said, yes. He said it in the tone of a message delivered from memory. Conveyance by order of the household, for the use of Mistress Cole, with the compliments of the Alpha King. You are requested to bring your professional materials. The household will provide the rest. A pause. He asks that you be ready within the hour. She looked at him. She said, within the hour. He nodded. She said, and if I need more than an hour? He blinked. The king asks within the hour, ma'am. She said, tell him an hour is fine. She closed the door and stood in the kitchen with her loose hair and her rough sleep wool, and behind her the fire was burning, and in the grate there was ash where the letter had been, and she thought 2 things clearly and in sequence. The first, she had never refused a patient. That principle had governed her practice from the first time her mother had handed her the compound kit and said, now you carry it. Whatever was complicated about the next hour, that was simple. The second, the king had been in the tree line last night, and 11 hours later there were horses at her gate. She went upstairs and changed into her working clothes, the dark gray linen trousers, the heavy tunic she wore for long days. The good boots she had resoled twice because their fit was exactly right, and she had never found another pair to match it. She braided her hair and pinned it properly. She came back down and packed her working satchel, the compound kit, the clean linen rolls, the knife roll with its 6 blades, the reference journal with its dog-eared pages and its margins full of her mother's annotations over her own, the small stone mortar that had been her grandmother's before it was her mother's, and was hers now, worn smooth inside in a way she had memorized with her palms over years of use. Her mother appeared at the bottom of the stairs as she was checking the buckle on the satchel. Nora Cole was a small woman who had spent 30 years being the most competent person in every room she walked into, and had learned, through long practice, that the most effective way to carry that was quietly. She looked at the satchel. She listened to the sounds outside. She stood at the bottom of the stairs and was very still for a moment. Then she said, King's Riders. Seraphine said, yes. Her mother said, all right. Seraphine said, I don't know how long. Her mother said, I know. The look on her mother's face was one Seraphine had seen before and recognized in her bones, not worry exactly, and not its opposite either. It was the face her mother made when she was holding 2 contradictory things simultaneously and had decided, for the present moment, to hold them both rather than force a resolution. She had made that face briefly at the ceremony, before Seraphine had looked away, and she was making it now. Seraphine picked up her satchel. She said, the fire needs banking around noon. Her mother said, I know that too. She hugged her mother. Not the careful kind. The real kind. Brief and tight, the way they had hugged each other her entire life. Before she understood what a hug was and after, as something that did not need to be analyzed because it simply was. Then she stepped back and took her coat from the hook and went to the door. Outside, the household guard sat patient on their horses in the cold morning. The young rider who had knocked was back in formation, watching the door with the professional attention of someone determined to look as if he had been doing this for years. The supply cart sat quiet on the path. The oilcloth over its cargo did not move in the still air. Seraphine walked to the nearest horse, checked the stirrup, and mounted without waiting for assistance. The horse was exceptional, responsive, well-trained, calm, the kind of animal that cost more than her cottage by a significant margin. She settled into the saddle and found the horse settling with her, which she approved of. The young rider looked at her with something between surprise and a respect he had not quite authorized himself to feel yet. She said, "I am ready." They moved out north, and she did not look back at the cottage because she had already said what needed saying, and looking back was not a habit she had, and was not a habit she was going to develop. She kept her eyes on the path ahead where it bent north and would eventually meet the main road toward the Blackthorn Keep. She was thinking about gray eyes in a tree line. She was thinking about what it meant that those eyes had watched the full length of the previous night, and that 11 hours later there were 7 horses and a supply cart at her gate. She was not thinking about Dorian Blackthorn or his letter, or the 3-day gap between the decision and the announcement. She had put that in the fire. She had watched it go to ash. She had kept the date and let the rest burn. She thought about what it meant to have been the person who waited for 6 years while the conclusion was already written on blackthorn paper in careful penmanship. She thought about this not with the heat of it. The heat had gone when the letter went to ash, but with the cooler, clearer analysis she could do now that the heat was gone. She had been patient. Patience was a real quality, and she did not undervalue it. But there was a difference between patience that was building towards something, and patience that was keeping you still while someone else decided the outcome without consulting you. She had been practicing the second kind. She understood this now. She understood also that this was done. The morning was light now, the pink-gray light that came in the hour after actual dawn, the quality of light she had always liked for its honesty. No performance in it, no drama, just the day being the day. She was riding toward it with 7 horses ahead of her, and she knew what the letter had said because she had read it, and she knew what the date on it had been, and she had burned it, and she was now riding north. She thought, I have been the edge for 22 years. She thought, I wonder what the center feels like. She was riding north toward a compound that needed making and a patient she had not yet met properly, in bad light, and she was going to do the work. The morning was cold and the path was clear and the world was entirely going about its business. She thought about Greta's observation notes and the 3 hours at the lodge table. She thought about Owen arranging the age distribution before she had fully articulated needing it. She thought about an elder tree at the east wall, maintained through 4 winters by someone who understood what was irreplaceable. She thought about a man standing in a tree line who was looking at the edge of the clearing. She thought, I notice these things. I have always noticed things. That is a quality I have and it serves me, and I have rarely in my life been in a place that noticed the things I noticed in return. She thought, I may be about to be in such a place. She thought, I should not decide that before I have the information. She had the 7 horses ahead and the supply cart and the morning in the east and the road north that she had never traveled, and she had the compound kit in her satchel and the reference journal and the knife roll and the good dress for occasions that warranted it. And she had the particular quality of preparedness that was not optimism, and not the absence of doubt, but the thing that came when you had done the work, and knew you had done it, and were willing to find out what came next. She had been willing her entire life. That was another of her qualities, and she did not undervalue it. So was she. She thought, with the specific quality of a mind that does not rest easily. The bond felt different this morning. She had been feeling it since 16, and she knew its texture the way she knew the texture of her own hands. And this morning on the North Road it felt different. Not gone, changed. The direction of it was the same as always, north-facing, persistent, the root that had found its water and had been growing that way for 6 years. This morning it felt like it was being answered. She filed this without analysis. She noted it, held it carefully, and turned her attention back to the road and the horses and the morning going about its business the way mornings did. So was she. The Blackthorn Keep was larger than it looked from the road. Most large buildings shrank as you approached them, the grandeur reducing as the distance collapsed, the scale becoming ordinary as it became physical reality. The keep did not do this. It grew as she rode toward it, revealing itself in pieces. A secondary wing that only appeared past the outer gate. Towers set back behind the main facade that were invisible from the road. A great herb garden along the east wall that she smelled before she saw it fully. Wild with 4 winters of neglect and still larger than her entire South Edge holding, by a factor that made her feel a complicated thing she did not stop to name. She noted the herb garden. She filed it away. Owen, the household steward, met her in the inner courtyard. He was a short man in his mid-50s whose face had the appearance of someone managing consistently more than could be reasonably managed by one person, who had lived with this imbalance long enough that it had become a permanent feature rather than a temporary circumstance. He introduced himself in 3 incomplete sentences and led her up the back staircase with the particular speed of someone who is trying to appear unhurried while moving quite quickly, talking the whole way, about the preparation room, about supplies, about the schedule, about the king's requirements, which was a phrase that tapered into silence before the requirements themselves were specified. She listened for the facts inside the fragments and collected each one. The preparation room was on the 2nd floor, north-facing. She approved of this before she had fully entered it. North light was steadier, cooler, and less variable through the day than the light from any other exposure. Steady light mattered when you were doing fine measurement work, and she was going to be doing a great deal of fine measurement work in this room. The space itself was large enough, a long stone table that she would have plenty of room on, 3 window shutters that opened independently so she could control the light and ventilation separately, a row of iron hooks on the east wall that had been used for drying at some earlier point and were empty now, and a smell that was equal parts dust and old time that told her the room had not been used for its intended purpose in some time. Owen gestured at the room with both hands in a way that seemed to be trying to cover several separate statements simultaneously, and settled for none of them. She said, "The compound I'm here to prepare. I need the purpose, the intended recipient population, and the timeline before I unpack." He blinked. I beg your pardon? The purpose, the patient or the patient population, the condition being addressed. I always need this before I begin. He opened his mouth, closed it, said, "That would be better coming from," and then, making the decision of a man who has run out of other available options, said, "I'll let the king know you're settled," and left at a pace that was just short of a run. She turned to the room. She placed her satchel on the stone table and opened it and began organizing what she had brought, and while her hands worked, she walked the room's perimeter in her head. The available light angles, the iron hooks and what they had once held, the implications of the dust and the time smell, the distance from the window to the table and what that meant for drying space. She was pacing the length of the table and measuring it with her hands, a habit she had kept from the first year her mother made her do it before setting up in any workspace, when the door opened. She turned, expecting Owen. The man in the doorway was not Owen. He was wearing dark riding gear that still carried the dust of the road, and he had to take note of the door frame as he came through because of his height, and when he looked across the room at her, his eyes were gray. She thought, the tree line, the seam between the torchlight and the dark. She said nothing. He said, "Mistress Cole." Not a greeting. A statement, the fact of her, confirmed aloud. The way a person marks the completion of something they needed to verify. She said, "My lord." He came into the room and looked at the table, at the materials she had already begun to lay out, at the reference journal, at the knife roll. He was reading them the way he had apparently read her in the tree line, with full, careful attention, and without visible attachment to any particular conclusion yet. He looked at the empty iron hooks. He looked at the shuttered windows. He said, "The light is better from the south-facing rooms." She said, "North light is steadier. The angle doesn't shift through the day, which means my measurements stay accurate from morning through evening." He looked at her. The gray eyes were different up close than they had been across a firelit clearing, more specific, somehow, as if they were built for this distance, and the distance of last night had been a concession to circumstance. He said, "Owen tells me you asked for the compound's purpose before agreeing to unpack." She said, "I ask that of every patient." He said, "I'm not the patient." She said, "Then who is?" He moved to the north window and opened one of the shutters. The gray morning light came in steady and even and good. He stood with his back partly to her, looking out at the courtyard below, and she took the time to observe him with the same attention she gave to everything she needed to understand, the set of the shoulders, the quality of the stillness, the way he occupied space without requiring the space to acknowledge him. It was the physical manner of someone who had been in positions of authority long enough that they no longer needed the room to confirm it. He said, "The compound is a winter prevention compound for the pack as a whole, to be distributed before the cold fully settles." Grede, the seer in the northern lodge, identified a gap. 3 winters without proper compound maintenance across most of the pack households. She said, 3 winters? He said, 4, if I'm being accurate. I prefer to be accurate. She said, 4 winters without compound maintenance means the pack is running on base immunity only. No reinforcement, no seasonal preparation. He said, I know. She said, base immunity is not sufficient for what comes off the northern ridge in deep winter, particularly for wolves past their 50th year, who process environmental stress differently. He said, I am also aware of that. It is why you are here and not someone closer. He turned from the window and looked at her directly. You are the best qualified person for this specific compound. That is a fact, not flattery. She said, I'll need full access to the herb garden. He said, take everything you need from it. She said, it hasn't been properly maintained. He said, I know, 4 winters. She said, some of what I'll require won't be there. I'll need a rider to the valley market, likely twice over the 14-day preparation period. He said, Owen will arrange both trips without question. She said, 14 days is the minimum for a compound of this scope. If you want it to hold through spring thaw, I'll need every one of those days. He said, take them. She nodded and turned back to her satchel and continued unpacking. She was lifting the stone mortar out when she heard him not move toward the door. He had moved further into the room, toward the table. She kept her back to him and kept working. He said, and the quality of his voice was different from the professional register it had carried for the previous 2 minutes. Quieter, more careful. You were at the edge of the clearing last night. She went entirely still. 1 breath. Counted. Then she set the stone mortar down on the table with the careful precision of someone who is paying close attention to what their hands are doing. She said, I was. He said, I saw you. She turned. She faced him across the table with the mortar between them and her hands at her sides, and nothing apologized for. And she said, I saw you too. Something moved behind the gray eyes. Too brief to name, too controlled to read with confidence. But it was there, and she had noted it. He said, I attend declaration ceremonies as protocol, as the king's witness to pack proceedings. I have done this many times. This was not a pause, and the pause itself was chosen. She could see him choosing it, the way she chose the right word in her reference journal, when the obvious one would not quite do. I was not standing at the tree line last night in any official capacity. She said, then what capacity? He looked at the mortar on the table. He looked at the empty hooks on the wall. He said, I'm telling you, because you deserve to know that last night was not the complete picture of what was witnessed. Of you, of what you are, of what this pack has been failing to see. She said, you've seen me for 3 seconds in poor light. He said, that is not when I started. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was the particular silence of 2 people who have both understood something at the same moment and have each independently decided not to rush whatever comes next. Outside, the courtyard was ordinary. Voices, horses, the supply cart being unloaded, and inside the room was very quiet and the north light was very steady. She said, I should begin the assessment. He said, yes. He stood on his side of the table for 1 more moment, looking at her with an attention that she could feel the weight of without being pressed by it. Then he moved to the door and stopped in the frame. He said, without turning back, the east wall of the herb garden. There is an elder tree against it, the old one, older than the keep. Whatever else in that garden has been neglected, that tree has not. If you need it, use it freely. She said, thank you. He left. She stood in the preparation room with the north light and the empty hooks and the stone mortar and the sound of the courtyard below, and she thought, with the precision she brought to all honest assessment, that is not what a professional transaction sounds like. She thought, I should stop thinking about it and start working. She began the full assessment of the room, moving from north wall to east, noting every shortage, every available resource, every factor that would affect the 14 days ahead. She filled 2 pages of the reference journal before she was done. Then she went downstairs and out into the cold and walked the length of the herb garden, slowly, noting everything. What was there, what was lost, what could be salvaged, what she would need from elsewhere. The garden was worse than she had hoped, and better than she had feared. Then she reached the east wall. The elder tree was enormous. She stopped and looked up through its branches at the gray sky. She put 1 hand on its bark, which was so deeply furrowed and so densely textured that it felt more like landscape than surface, more like the face of a cliff than the bark of a tree. It was very old. She could read the age in the root spread, in the way the tree had grown into the mortar of the wall rather than away from it. in the particular thickness of its upper canopy that only came from a long time of steady, uninterrupted growth in exactly the right place. And it was healthy. Deeply, solidly healthy in a way that was unmistakable. Whatever had gone untended in this garden, this had not. Someone had been seeing to this tree through the 4 winters of neglect, maintaining the one thing they made a point of maintaining. She took out her knife and began to assess the lower branches. She was standing in the mud with her knife in one hand and a lower branch in the other, her braid working loose from its pins, her breath making small clouds in the cold air, when she looked up and found him watching her from the upper window of the north wing. He did not look away when their eyes met. She went back to assessing the branch. She thought, 14 days. She thought, this elder is exceptional. She stayed a while longer in the herb garden than the compound assessment required. This was unusual for her. She was not, as a rule, someone who lingered in places without a purpose, who let the length of her time in any location exceed what the work demanded. She had been efficient since she was a child, had been efficient because efficiency was a kind of protection, because a person who was doing the clearly necessary thing was not easily asked to account for herself. She used her time well, and the visible use of it was a kind of armor. But the garden was extraordinary. Not in its current state. It was overgrown in patches, neglected in the 4 specific ways that 4 winters of reduced attention produce. The yarrow gone to seed in the east corner, and the winter savory that had probably been here before she arrived already past the point of useful harvest. These were fixable problems. These were problems that 2 or 3 seasons of correct attention would reverse. What was extraordinary was the underlying structure. The placement of every plant family was deliberate, was the placement of someone who understood the principles of companion growing in medicinal gardens, who knew that the elder kept the insects the yarrow needed, and that the dog rose on the south side blocked the wind at exactly the right angle, and that the winterberry in the corner caught the last of the afternoon light in the season when it needed it. This garden had been built by someone who understood not just what the plants were but how they worked together. It was, she looked around it again, confirming what she was seeing. It was built to be a healer's garden, a professional working garden, not an ornamental one, designed for function at the highest possible level. She thought about the king's mother planting the elder 40 years ago. A cutting from the North Pack, he had said, someone who knew exactly where to put it and why. She thought about what it meant that this garden still held the structure of that knowing even after 4 winters of reduced attention. Good underlying structure persisted. That was another thing her mother had told her and she had understood correctly, and was now understanding at a different weight. She went back to assessing the branch. She thought, this elder is exceptional. She worked in the cold through the rest of the morning, and when the light changed and her hands told her it was past noon, she went back inside to the preparation room, and opened her reference journal, and began to plan. She had everything she needed to begin. She had what she had brought, and what was in the storage caves under the east block that Owen had confirmed in the afternoon. Not empty at all, whatever Owen had been telling himself, and what was in the garden, and what the rider would bring from the valley. She had 14 days, and a plan, and a stone table with good north light. She thought about the garden one more time before she turned to the stone table and began. She thought about the 4 years of reduced attention and what remained despite it, the elder tree, and the companion relationships between the remaining plantings, and the deep structure of where things had been placed originally. The knowledge hadn't left the garden when the knowing person left it. It remained in the arrangement. You could read it if you knew how to look. She thought, I have always known how to look. She thought, this is useful to know about myself. She opened the reference journal to the first working page and uncapped the charcoal and drew the first line of the measurement grid. She was not going to waste the north light. She began. The compound work, on the first day, had the quality of beginning, the specific feeling of a thing that has been waiting to start and is now starting, which was its own kind of clarity. She worked through the late morning and the early afternoon in the preparation room, and when Owen knocked at the door at noon with a tray, she did not stop fully but said, leave it, and he left it, and she ate at the table without looking at the food, because the work was at a stage that required her eyes, and she had been trained since girlhood to eat without looking at the plate when the eyes were needed elsewhere. This skill had served her at 12 compound tables and in 2 borrowed preparation rooms, and in the South Cottage in every winter she could remember. It served her now. She worked until the light changed. She noted the change, noted the time, sealed the current stage and capped the charcoal, and stretched her back, and then ate the rest of the food on the tray, which was cold and still good. She began. Dinner in the Blackthorn Keep was formal every evening, regardless of who was present or how many were at the table. Seraphine had not intended to attend it. She had planned to work late in the preparation room and accept a tray when Owen or one of the kitchen servants brought one up. This was the plan she had mapped for herself in the afternoon as she worked through the initial assessment, and she had been comfortable with it. Owen had appeared at the preparation room door at 6:30 with the manner of a man delivering a message he had been given with zero room for negotiation, and had communicated, in 2.5 fragmented sentences, that her presence was requested in the main hall for the household dinner. She had washed her hands 3 times, and still had a trace of garden mud under the second fingernail of her right hand. She put on the same clothes she had worn all day, the working ones, the good boots, the braid repinned properly after it had come loose in the garden, and she walked into the main hall with the mud under that fingernail, and the mortar callus on her palm, and the particular quality of a person who has nothing to explain or apologize for, and has not begun doing either. The long table could seat perhaps 30 on a full formal evening. Tonight it held 8, the king at the head, 4 household counselors in their formal colors, an older white-haired woman at the king's right hand that she did not yet know, a younger man in Beta House colors at the king's left, and at the far end where the table narrowed, Dorian Blackthorne. She saw him the moment she stepped into the room. He was leaning back in his chair with the ease of someone entirely at home in this space. The Blackthorne Keep, the Blackthorne table, surrounded by people who were accustomed to his presence and arranged around it comfortably, and he did not look up when she entered. She walked to the remaining empty seat at the far end and sat across from him, and noted that he still had not acknowledged her arrival. The older white-haired woman was Greta. Owen had named her on the stairs. The pack seer from the Northern Lodge, white-haired, with the particular face of someone who stopped performing expressions sometime in their 50s, and settled instead into a permanent direct reading of what was actually in front of them. She was looking at Seraphine with the steady attention of someone confirming a conclusion already reached. Seraphine met her gaze without hesitation. Greta nodded, slowly, with a warmth that was particular for coming from a complete stranger, and Seraphine filed that too. Dinner began. The food was good. Winter vegetables roasted simply, dark bread still warm, a meat broth with thyme and onion that smelled of the kind of cooking that takes all day and makes no apology for the time. She ate because she had been working since early morning and her body was requiring fuel regardless of the circumstances, and while she ate she listened to the conversation moving around the table with the attention she gave to rooms she did not yet fully understand. The counselors talked about the northern border agreements and the winter supply route. Grady said almost nothing. But on 2 occasions she said something that landed exactly in the center of whatever topic the room had been circling without finding, and then fell silent again. The king led the dinner without appearing to, asking questions, redirecting when something stalled, leaving space for the counselors to fill, and filling it himself when they left it too long. He ran it the same way he ran everything she had observed him run today, efficiently, attentively, without visible effort. She had been studying this for most of the first course when Dorian began speaking. She caught it first in the slight recalibration of one of the counselors, the tilt of a head, a micro-adjustment of posture, the movement of someone who has just been handed a social cue and is deciding whether or not to take it up. Then Dorian's voice, carrying the easy confidence of a person who has never said something at a dinner table and regretted it. The Cole family has been supplying compounds to the Blackthorne pack for 2 generations, solid family tradition. My father relied on the mother's formulas for years. A pause, light, unhurried. It's good work, very suited to pack-keeper purposes. The king's household is a different context, of course, but the compound methods are transferable, essentially the same recipes, handed down. He said this to the counselor beside him, not to her. About her. The counselor being addressed looked at his soup. Seraphine cut a piece of bread and ate it. She was not going to say anything to that. There was nothing she needed to say that the situation itself had not already said by existing. She understood what the performance was, not malice in any deliberate sense, the casual kind, the kind that doesn't examine itself because it has never needed to. He was establishing an interpretation of her presence before the table could form its own. He was drawing a line around her using language that was technically complimentary and precisely wrong. Complimentary about a version of her that was smaller, less, contained, the daughter of the family trade, the same recipes passed hand to hand. She cut another piece of bread and ate that too. The king had not moved. He was holding his cup with one hand and he was completely still, which she had already in the course of one day come to understand was not inattention. It was the opposite. He said, "The compounds you've developed yourself, are they variations on your mother's formulas, or do they start from different principles?" He was speaking to her, across the table, directly, with the full quality of his attention, as if the previous 60 seconds of the conversation had not occurred, or had occurred, and been noted, and moved past with the efficiency of someone who is not interested in dwelling on things that do not require dwelling on. She looked up. She said, "Some are variations on the Northern Seer tradition modified for this territory's specific plant availability. Some are my mother's adaptations of standard formulas. A few begin from different principles entirely." He said, "Which ones?" She said, "The Cold Ridge winter compound is mine. My mother's version was adequate for standard winters, but 3 years ago we had a cold come off the North Ridge harder than usual, and her formula wasn't holding in the older pack members. I worked out a revised formula over about a week of careful testing." He said, "Did the revision hold?" She said, "Yes, through the full cold season and the following 2. He said, "What was the central problem with the existing formula?" She said, "The elder to yarrow ratio is designed for adults in peak health. Wolves past their 50th year process the active compounds differently. The absorption rate is different, and the standard ratio assumes a baseline metabolic condition that older wolves don't consistently meet in winter. I had to calibrate specifically for that population." Grady said, from her position at the king's right hand, in the tone of someone confirming something they have long known, "She's right about the absorption differential. Set it to the table generally, the way a seer says something when they want it to land as confirmation rather than argument." Dorian had stopped talking to the counselor beside him. He was looking at the table. The king said, "I'd like to see your documentation for the revised formula when you have something written out during the current preparation." She said, "I'll have something ready by day 3. He said, "Good," and returned to the counselor on his left with the smooth continuity of someone concluding one thread and picking up the next, the dinner folding forward over the moment the way water closes. She ate the rest of her dinner, the soup, the bread, a small piece of the roasted root vegetables that had been set near her end of the table. She ate and listened and observed, and did not say anything else that was not directly addressed to her, which was not unusual behavior for her at a table where she knew no one well. After the dinner was concluded and the household rose and began the smaller conversations that break off from formal evenings as people move toward different parts of the room and the exits, she went to the side chair near the entrance where she had left her coat and began putting it on. She heard footsteps behind her, not Owen's hurried shuffle, something more deliberate. She turned. The king was 3 feet away, coat already on. He had taken the direct route from his place at the table and not the circuitous conversational route the counselors were taking. He was looking at her with the expression she was coming to identify as his default state when he was not actively performing any particular official function. Settled, present, waiting, with a quality that was patient rather than passive. She said, "My lord." He said, "Walk with me." Not quite a command, not quite an invitation. Something honest that occupied the space between the two. She said, "Where?" He said, "The north path along the keep wall. I need to tell you something about the storage caves under the east block that will save you a significant portion of tomorrow morning's supply calculation." She considered this for exactly the length of time it took her to decide it was true. She said, "All right." They went out the side door and the night was clear and cold, the moon a day past full and still bright enough to put clear shadows on the flagged stone of the north path. The keep wall rose on one side, and the open courtyard garden on the other, bare and winter-stripped. He walked at a pace she did not have to adjust her stride for. She noticed this because it was not common. He said, "The storage caves under the east block, Owen will tell you they're empty or nearly so. They aren't. My father stored raw materials in bulk during his tenure, and when he died, I had a full inventory taken but nothing was moved. There should be dried elder, yarrow, and preserved dog rows from 3 or 4 years back, that ought still to be within usable condition. The cave is consistently cool and dry." She said, "That is a significant change to my supply calculations." He said, "I thought it would be." She said, "Why didn't Owen mention it when I was asking about the herb garden this afternoon?" He said, "Owen is aware that there are things in those caves and has spent considerable energy developing a very thorough ignorance of what specifically those things are." The pause was brief but present, the almost humor that lived just beneath his surface. "It is one of his most effective strategies." She said, "Useful for him." He said, "Exclusively." They walked. The wall blocked most of the wind and the cold was manageable under it. She could see her breath. The path curved with the line of the keep wall. She said, "You attended last night as more than a witness." He did not break his pace. He said, "Yes." She said, "And 11 hours after the ceremony there were horses at my gate." He said, "Yes." She said, "The compound is a real need." He said, "Entirely real and urgent." She said, "But." He stopped. She stopped beside him. He was looking up at the keep wall above them, at the moonlight on the old stone. He had his hands in his coat pockets and his expression was the settled one, the waiting one. He said, there were 3 settlements in the same quarterly supply report, all with the same 4-winter maintenance gap. My original plan was to send a supply rider to Greta with an order for standard compounds. That was the plan before the ceremony. She said, what changed? He said, I went to the ceremony. She looked at him. He said, the compound is the reason I could give Owen when I asked him to send the horses. It is a real reason, and it required doing. You are the most qualified person I could have sent for. He turned from the wall. It is not the only reason. She said, you watched a rejection ceremony and dispatched horses within the night. He said, I watched a woman stand in the center of a full pack gathering and hold herself with more dignity than anyone else present, while the people around her settled into the thing they had apparently been anticipating and were pleased to see arrive. He stopped. He said it very plainly, and I sent horses. Yes. She did not have an answer to that, not because she was undone by it, she was not, or not in any way that was going to show, but because it was the kind of statement that was complete as it was, that answered its own question, and did not need addition. He said, I'll have Owen show you the storage caves first thing tomorrow. The rider for the Valley Market leaves at noon. Anything you want added to the list, tell Owen before then. He turned toward the door. She said, my lord. He turned back. She said, thank you. For the dinner. For the storage caves. For, she stopped herself before the third thing and said simply, for the information. He held her gaze for a moment. Said, sleep well, Mistress Cole. She stood on the flagged stone in the moonlight and heard his footsteps return to the door, and she looked at the moon for a while, which did not comment, and then she thought, 14 days and what they are going to be made of. She turned it over in her mind before sleep the way she turned things over that she was not yet ready to conclude on. Not what to think about it. The 14 days, the horses, the information he had offered her plainly on the north wall. What to do with the fact that he had said it at all. The Alpha King had a particular relationship to candor that she had not encountered before in people who held equivalent authority. The ones she had met in her limited experience of official contexts were people who held their information with both hands and released it only in quantities that served them precisely. He had stood on the north wall and said, it is not the only reason. He had said, I sent horses. Yes, without wrapping it in anything, without softening the shape of it. She was a person who worked with precision and did not make things less than they were to make them easier to carry. She recognized the same quality in him, and it was, she looked for the right word, the specific one. It was useful. It was the quality that made the next 11 days look possible in a specific way. Not just the compound, all of it. She did not name what all of it was. She was not ready to name it. It was too early to name it, and she knew herself well enough to know that naming things before they had completed their shape was how she had made mistakes in the past, and the past had taught her to wait for the complete shape before the name. She waited. She went to sleep. In the morning, Owen showed her the storage caves. In the morning, Owen showed her the storage caves. She had not fully slept, but she was rested in the way of a person who has spent the night thinking clearly rather than not sleeping, which was a different kind of rested and sufficed. She dressed in the gray working clothes and put on the coat and went downstairs in the pre-dawn quiet. Owen was already in the corridor with a lamp. He said, I thought you might be early. She said, I am always early. He said, I know. He said it with the expression of a man who had prepared for this, and was pleased that his preparation was vindicated. The storage caves were built into the north slope behind the keep. 2 generations of enlargement, Owen explained as they went down the stone stairs, with the older section to the left and the newer section to the right, and the temperature differential between them that she should take into account when assessing storage quality. He held the lamp steady while she moved along the shelves, and he did not talk while she was examining things, which was the most useful quality a person in his position could have, and which she stored as information about him. The cave inventory was understated. Not by accident. She would understand this later, that Owen had kept his estimate conservative until he could confirm what was actually there. But standing in the older section with the lamp throwing its steady yellow light across shelves of elder and yarrow and winterberry in better condition than she had expected, she felt the particular quality of an assessment that was going to require revision upward. She thought, this is more than I thought I had. She thought, this changes what the compound can be. She thought, I need to recalculate the threshold. She went back upstairs and opened the reference journal before breakfast and began. Day 3 of the preparation looked different than day 1. The stone table had been transformed from a surface she had been given permission to use into a workspace she had claimed completely. Left side, raw materials organized by type, the dried elder from the storage caves ranked by quality in descending order from right to left, yarrow in bundles, 3 grades of dog rose laid in a row of descending potency, the winterberry the valley rider had brought back yesterday processed and ready. Right side, the reference journal open to the current working page, the knife roll spread and secured, the stone mortar in its correct position at the center right of the work area. In the middle, the measurement grid she had drawn in charcoal on a length of oilcloth, plotting the elder to yarrow ratios against the pack's age distribution, which she had received on day 1 from the king without having asked for it. She had mentioned needing the age distribution at the 8 o'clock meeting on day 1, in passing, as information she would eventually require. It had been in her hands in Owen's handwriting before she returned from the herb garden that morning, organized by decade, complete, accurate. She had been thinking about that at intervals for 2 days now. The evening of day 2 she had gone to the northern lodge with the young guard Owen had assigned her, up the east path through the pine stands, to meet Greta. The lodge was small and very warm inside, and smelled of the specific things an old seer's living space smelled of. Accumulated years of burning particular herbs, the dense textile smell of many blankets, wood that had absorbed a great deal of history. Greta had been in the chair nearest the fire with a cup of something she did not offer to share and her observation notes already organized in 3 piles on the table, which was the gesture of a woman who had expected the visit and had prepared for it specifically. She had said, "You are Nora Cole's daughter." Seraphine had said, "Yes." Greta had said, "I met your mother once, 30 years ago, at a pack gathering in the valley. She was 17, and she knew more about winter compounds than the attending healer. I told her so. She thanked me with the expression of someone who already knows a thing, and is grateful to have it confirmed but does not need the confirmation." She had looked at Seraphine with the direct attention that was her consistent manner. "You have her expression exactly." She had said, "I'll take that." Greta had handed her the first pile of observation notes without preamble, and they had worked together at the table for 3 hours, going through the records year by year, the winter resilience data, the elder distribution records, the compound response notes Greta had kept in her precise angular handwriting across 4 consecutive winters. She was a methodical observer. She had noted every anomaly and marked each one with its potential cause and the outcome, so that the record was not just data but analysis, built-in, cross-referenced, and more useful than raw data alone. At the end of the 2nd hour, Seraphine had said, looking at the record for 2 winters ago, "This response variance in the senior group, the standard compound held for most of them but not for this cluster here, who had a significantly worse winter than the others in the same age tier. The attending compound worker the year before me would have attributed this to individual variation." Greta had said, "She did attribute it to individual variation." Seraphine had said, "It's not individual variation. It's a subgroup threshold. The cluster is in the transition zone between the standard elder ratio and the elevated ratio, and they're getting the standard dose at the wrong end of the transition window. If I set the threshold line 2 years earlier than the population average, this cluster comes into the elevated dose range and the variance disappears." Greta had been quiet for a moment. She had said, "Can you prove that from the existing records?" Seraphine had said, "I can demonstrate it probabilistically. Proof requires another winter's data at the revised calibration." Greta had said, "Then do the revised calibration and we will have the proof next winter." She had refilled her cup and said, "Your mother would have found the same thing. In her 2nd year rather than your 1st. Seraphine had said, "She would have found it in her 1st year." Greta had looked at her. Then she had said, "Yes, probably," with a warmth that was the warmest thing the seer's face appeared capable of producing. She had walked back to the keep at midnight with the observation notes under her arm and 3 extra pages of her own, and she had felt, in the cold air on the east path with the pines above her and the stars very clear in the gaps between them, the particular quality of having spent an evening working at the full extent of what she was capable of. She had been thinking about that at intervals for 2 days now. The king came at 8 o'clock on day 3, the way he had come on days 1 and 2, exactly on time, without announcement, with the same unhurried entrance that gave her a moment to finish what she was working on before she turned. She had been in the preparation room since before 5 in the morning. This was not unusual for her during the precise calibration phase. She worked best in the pre-dawn hours when the keep was sleeping, when the only sound was the building's own sounds, the stones settling in the cold, the distant stables, the intermittent sound of the river when the wind was right. She had been doing the pre-dawn work on and off since day 1, using those hours for the measurements that required the most uninterrupted concentration, and today she had used them for the threshold calibration. the exact line above which the standard compound ratio failed to serve older wolves reliably. She had been working toward that line for 3 days, building from Greta's observation notes and the age distribution and her own experience of the South Pack. And this morning the three of them had come together in a way she recognized, the quiet, clean resolution of a problem that had been approached correctly from multiple directions simultaneously. She stood at the measurement grid and looked at the line she had drawn. It was good work. The specific kind of good that was not about completion but about precision, about having gotten the thing right rather than approximately right. She held the distinction in high regard. Most people who were good at what they did produced results that were approximately right, and approximately right was sufficient for most circumstances. What she had in front of her now was not approximately right. It was right. She noted this without performance and turned to see who had come through the door. She was at the measurement grid. She finished the notation she was making before she set down the charcoal piece and turned. He was in the doorway, looking at the table. She had noticed this about his arrivals. He always looked at the table first, reading the room, reading the day's work, understanding the current state of things before he entered fully into the space. He said, "Day 3 looks different than day 1. She said, "Day 3 is different than day 1. I know what I'm working with now. The uncertainty of the first day is gone and the plan is clear." He came in and stood at the opposite side of the table and looked at the measurement grid without touching it. She had noticed this also, that he looked at things carefully before he handled them, that he did not reach for what was not his. She said, "The elder from the storage caves is better quality than I expected given the storage time. The cave conditions preserved it exactly right. This shifts my ratio calculation in favor of the elder base, which is good. It means better coverage from the same volume of compound." He said, "How much better?" She said, "At the current revised ratio, I'm calculating coverage for approximately 30 more wolves than the standard formula would provide. Given your pack's full count, that should reach everyone, which was not a guarantee on day 1. He said, "That is considerably better than the estimate 2 days ago." She said, "Yes." He said, "And day 14 from here?" She said, "If the quality holds through the full remaining stock, and if the second Valley Market Rider returns by day 7 with the supplementary materials, I should have a complete set finished by day 13, 1 day's margin." He nodded, looking at the charcoal lines on the oilcloth. He said, "The curve at the left edge here," he indicated it without touching. "The careful habit of a man who points rather than takes. What is that?" She said, "That is the age threshold. Below that line, the standard elder to yarrow ratio is sufficient for good compound performance. Above it, the elder weight needs to increase in proportion to age, because older wolves process the active compounds at a different rate. The absorption differs and the standard ratio over-calibrates for a metabolic baseline older wolves don't consistently hold in winter conditions. I'm pinpointing the exact threshold for your pack specifically, rather than using the population average, because pack-specific calibration always produces a better result." He said, "You're doing pack-specific calibration for the full compound set." She said, "Yes." He said, "That's not standard practice for a 14-day preparation." She said, "Most compound workers are covering 3 or 4 packs simultaneously. They don't have the time for pack-specific work. I'm here for 14 days and for 1 compound set. I have the time, and when I have the time I use it." He looked at her over the measurement grid with the movement behind his eyes that she had seen twice before and still could not name precisely. Too controlled to be fully legible, too present to be dismissed. He said, "The rider leaves at noon for the Valley Market. Anything to add to yesterday's list?" She said, "Winterberry, if they have it. It's not essential, but it improves the compound's performance in the wet months specifically, and you have 3 wet months on this ridge before spring." He said, "I'll tell Owen before the rider leaves." He was quiet for a moment. Still. The specific kind of still that she was coming to recognize meant he had something he was deciding how to say. He said, "Grady is coming down from the lodge tomorrow, weather permitting. She wants to meet with you." She said, "I would welcome that. Her 4-year observation of the pack's winter resilience will let me calibrate the threshold line with more precision than the written records give me alone." He said, "I'll confirm with her this afternoon." He said it, and then did not move toward the door. He stood on the other side of the table, and looked at her with the quality of attention that she had been inside for 3 days, and still had not found the correct word for. Not professional assessment, not the considering quality, not the one she had seen briefly on the North Walk. Something different, quieter, more fixed. She set down the charcoal piece and looked back at him. He said, "When I stood at the tree line the night of the ceremony, the direction I was facing." He stopped. He chose the next words the way she would choose a herb for a formula, knowing what each one does and selecting the right one. It was not toward Dorian. She said nothing. He said, I am telling you this because we are 3 days into 14, and you are a person who holds things carefully until you understand them, and I would rather you understood this specific thing correctly than have it sit in the wrong category for 11 more days while we are working in the same room. She said, you were attending a pack ceremony. The ceremony was in the clearing. He said, yes, and I was watching it, but the point toward which my attention was most specifically directed was not the center of the clearing. Another pause, another choice. It was the edge. She was very still. She said carefully, that could mean several different things. He said, it could. I'm telling you what it means for me. She thought about the measurement grid and the 14 days, and the specific discipline of not deciding anything before you had enough information to decide it well. She said, I burned a letter this morning, before the horses arrived. He said, I know. She said, you know? He said, not what it contained, that it existed, that he had written it before the ceremony. He said it without emphasis, which was the most honest way to say it. I know because I know how Dorian executes decisions. He administers them in writing before he acts on them publicly. There is always documentation prepared in advance. I assumed a letter existed the moment I understood he was declining. A pause. I'm telling you I know, so that you understand I am not coming to you in ignorance of what last night cost you. She said, it didn't cost as much as you might think. He said, I know that too. She said, then why? She stopped. She started again. Because the question was honest, and she was going to ask it honestly. Why are we having this conversation? Here, like this. Why not just the compound in the 14 days? He said, because I want to be honest with you about what these 14 days are, and what they also are. What they are, a real compound your pack needs, work that is genuinely urgent, you being the best person for it. What they also are, my deliberate attempt to be in the same space as you long enough for you to form an honest opinion of me without anyone's interference. He picked up the measuring cord from the table's edge, looked at it, set it back exactly where it had been. That is all I'm asking. 14 days of real work. At the end of them, we both see where we stand. She looked at the measuring cord in the same position he had found it. She said, that is an unusually direct thing to say. He said, I am an unusually direct person. And the thing that was not quite humor was right there at the surface, just below it, pressing. She said, the work is real. He said, the work is entirely real. She said, and these 14 days are for the work. He said, yes. And for whatever else they become, in whatever proportion they become it, without pressure, without expectation of any specific outcome. He held her gaze. If the outcome is that you know more about me than you did 2 weeks ago, that is enough. If it is more than that, I will not pretend I am indifferent to the possibility. She turned back to the measurement grid because the alternative was to stand in the north light and let the morning do something she was not yet certain she wanted to do. And she had Elder to sort, and Winterberry to plan for, and 8 days of careful work still in front of her. She said, to the charcoal grid, the moisture conditions in the storage cave. Ask Owen whether there is variance by section, or whether the conditions are consistent throughout. If there is variance, it will affect the elder quality unevenly, and I need to know. He said, I was going to ask him anyway. And before she could respond to that, he said, I'll tell you what he says at 8 tomorrow. She heard him cross to the door. She heard the door open, and then she heard what she was coming to recognize as the specific quality of breath before the thing that was not quite a smile, but existed in that same register, there and then gone. The door closed. She stood at the measurement grid for a moment, the charcoal in her hand, the north light steady. She thought, it was not nothing. She put the thought down in its place and went back to the work. The work was what she was certain about, and in uncertain territory, certainty was the most reliable place to stand. She worked until the evening, and when the light from the north window told her it was past the useful hour, she sealed the current stage, and cleaned the table and recorded the day's measurements in the reference journal, with the specificity she always used. Exact ratios, exact quantities, exact observations about material quality that she would need to reference in tomorrow's calibration work. She wrote until the page was complete and the record was sufficient. Then she closed the journal. She looked at the table, empty now and wiped clean, the oilcloth folded. She thought, tomorrow the threshold line. She thought, tomorrow. She went downstairs and ate what Owen had left for her, and she sat in the small dining room with the fire and thought about directions and destinations, and the specific quality of work that was going exactly as it should go, which she had not always had, and which she did not take for granted. The pack knew by day 5. She had not told anyone. She had spoken to Owen, to Great, to 2 kitchen servants who brought her meals, and none of those 4 were the source. Owen for reasons of elaborate self-protective discretion, Great because Sears did not carry gossip, the kitchen servants because they had not been paying close enough attention to her specifically. But information in a Pack household moved through the spaces between spoken things, through the noticing of new patterns and the absence of familiar ones, through the particular mathematics of an alpha king whose first hour every morning for 5 consecutive days had been spent in a second-floor preparation room, with a woman who was not from this household, and was not in any official category that anyone could easily name. She first understood that the Pack knew on the morning of day 5, when she crossed the main courtyard after her early work in the herb garden, and 4 household wolves who had been talking in a cluster near the south well, all found reasons to look in 4 separate directions at exactly the same moment, with the very precise coordination of people who have been discussing the approaching subject, and have not yet decided what to do about the fact that it is now walking directly toward them. She kept walking. The second signal was at noon. The kitchen servant who brought her tray was not the usual one. It was a younger girl with bright, alert eyes, and the ready alertness of someone who had either volunteered for this particular errand, or been selected for it because she could be relied upon to observe carefully and report back with accuracy. She set the tray down and looked around the preparation room with the systematic thoroughness of someone taking inventory. Seraphine said, "Thank you," and waited until the footsteps had cleared the staircase entirely before touching the food. The third signal was Dorian. He came to the preparation room on the afternoon of day 5. She heard the knock and said, "Come in," expecting Owen with the supply confirmation. The door opened and Dorian came in, stood in the doorway and looked at the room, at the stone table with its organized materials and its charcoal measurement grid, at her. His expression was the one she had not seen on him before the dinner on day 1, and had not fully had the vocabulary for then, and had since found the word for managed. He was managing his expression the way a person manages something that requires managing, which was to say it was close to controlled irritation, and was working hard at being something else. He said, "I wanted to check that the work was proceeding well." She said, "The work is proceeding well." He said, "Good." He looked at the stone table again. "The Pack is talking." She said, "I expect so." He said, "That doesn't concern you." She said, "People in Packs talk. I've been the keeper's daughter at the South Edge for 22 years. People talked about my mother, and they talked about me, and they talked about the work we do, and the people we do it for, and the prices we charge for it, and whether the compounds were as good as the ones from the valley. People talking is not new information." He said, "This is different from the ordinary kind." She looked at him steadily. She said, "Is there something specific you need, Dorian?" The name without a title stopped him. She had never in her life addressed him without one. She saw it land, the brief interruption in his managed expression, the recalibration. She had not planned it. It had come from the practical mode, the one she was always in when she was working, the one that stripped things back to what they actually were. He was standing in the doorway of her workspace as a complication to the work, and the practical mode did not accommodate the specific performance his visit seemed to require. He said, "I need you to understand what you are in the middle of." She said, "I'm in the middle of a compound preparation." He said, The king extends this kind of attention to things that interest him. It doesn't. It isn't what you're imagining. It doesn't lead where you're thinking it leads." She looked at him for a long, quiet moment. She said, "You came here to tell me not to get ideas." He said, "I came because..." She said, "You wrote the letter 3 days before the ceremony." He went completely still. She said, "You used the good Pack paper with the blackthorn watermark in the fiber. You wrote my name on the outside in your clearest penmanship. You sealed it with blackthorn wax and you kept it ready, and then you placed it under my mat after you had already stood before the full gathered Pack and said what you said, so that I would find it in the morning when there was nothing left to do with it but read it, and understand that the answer had been decided before the question was ever publicly asked." She kept her voice even, entirely even. "I burned it, but I remember the date on it. I will always remember the date." He said nothing. The silence held for a moment, not comfortable, not quite uncomfortable either, just present. She said, "Go back to the hall, Dorian. I have work to do." He left. She heard his footsteps all the way down the staircase. She sat in the council chamber and let the room be what it was for a moment. She thought about what he had said, the last thing, at the door. "I find it easier to be honest with someone I have stopped wanting something from." It had cost him something to say it. She was certain of this. Not in a way she needed to trace back to its source, She had spent enough time in the same rooms with him to understand his registers, the surface ones and the ones beneath them. The surface, polished, managed, the practiced ease of someone who had always found rooms to be comfortable places. Beneath it, something less settled, something that required more maintenance than it appeared to. She had seen this clearly for the first time today, in the council chamber, when the polished surface had not been sufficient to manage what the morning was requiring of him. He had not been expecting the date. She thought about that. He had come to the council chamber expecting several things and had encountered the date, and the date had done what accurate information did when it landed in the right place at the right moment. It had changed the shape of the room without anyone having to argue for the change. It had simply been there, 3 days before, in blackthorn wax, with the specific quality of a decision made in private before the public performance of the decision, which was the quality she had been certain of from the morning she found the letter, and had held with the accuracy she held all important facts. She thought, I did that correctly. She thought, knowing the date and keeping it and using it in the right moment, that was correct. She thought, I have always known what to hold and when to release it. She thought about the compound work in the preparation room, the measurement grid and the threshold calibration, and the elder from the storage caves. She thought about the way precise work proceeded. You gathered the information, you held it in the right arrangement, you released it at the right moment in the right form, and the compound did what it was supposed to do. The council chamber this morning had been a version of that process. Different materials, same underlying method. Her method. The one she had been developing and refining for 22 years in a cottage at the south edge of a territory that had not been looking at her. She thought, I have been doing this all along. She thought, I just didn't know the scale yet. She heard footsteps in the corridor, not Dorian's. These were measured and unhurried, the particular pace she had been recognizing for 14 days. She straightened in the council chair and looked at the door. He came in and sat down beside her and looked at the room without speaking first, which was his way, assessing the current state before adding to it. She waited. He said, How are you? She said, I am well. He said, That was well done. She said, The argument was correct. It was the argument that did the work. He said, Yes, and you made it. He said it simply, the way he said things that were facts. You were asked a direct question in a formal council, and you answered it directly and correctly, and let the answer carry the weight, rather than requiring additional support. A pause. That is not as easy as you made it look. She said, I have been doing versions of that my whole life. He said, I know. He looked at her. That is one of the things I have been watching for 14 days. She said, What else have you been watching for? He said, after a moment, with the quality of a person who is considering how honest to be, and is deciding in favor of complete honesty, whether you would be all right, whether the 14 days would be what I hoped they would be for both of us, and not something I had arranged poorly. She said, They were what you hoped? He said, Yes. Then, more, actually. She was still. She said, You said that on day 3 too. You said it was not nothing. He said, It wasn't. She said, It was considerably more than nothing. He said, Yes. She said, You can say so. He held her gaze for a long moment. He said, It was considerably more than nothing, in both directions. A pause. Is that honest enough? She said, That is exactly honest enough. She stood up. She smoothed her dress. She picked up the pendant from where it had been resting at her throat and let it fall back, a gesture that was habit already hers. She said, I'm going to write the distribution instructions this afternoon. Owen needs them before I leave. He said, I know. She said, And tomorrow is tomorrow. He said, Yes. She walked to the door. She stood at the stone table and looked at the measurement grid and breathed through the next 60 seconds. The anger had moved through her for the length of that exchange. Clean, directed, the familiar thing she reached for when something got complicated enough to threaten the part of her that needed to stay steady. It had done its work. She had needed it to do its work, and it had. She let it settle. She went back to the yarrow. The compound work had a rhythm that she had established on day 1 and had held through every day since. An early stage of measurement, a mid-stage of processing, a late stage of verification and storage. The rhythm was not imposed on the work required the stages, and the stages required the rhythm. She had found this was true of all work that was worth doing. It contained its own necessary sequence, and the skill was not in creating that sequence but in reading it correctly and following what it asked for. She was in the mid-stage now, processing the second yarrow batch at the ratio the threshold calibration required. The motion was repetitive, fold, press, measure, and had the quality that repetitive motion acquired in long work sessions. Not boredom, but a certain emptying out. The surface occupied by the hands, while the deeper part of the mind could move freely without her managing it. She was thinking about Dorian's face when he had said, "You know what you're in the middle of." Not with heat. She was past the heat now. The anger had been clean and useful, and had done its work and left. What she was left with was a colder, clearer observation, which was this. He had come to the room because he was afraid. Not afraid of her specifically. Not afraid of what she might do with whatever she had seen or understood. Afraid of the thing he could not name for himself without naming also his own quality, which was that he was a man who had made a decision at distance and executed it with clean, cold efficiency, and had found himself, unexpectedly, in the proximity of the person on the other end of that decision. She thought, he came here expecting someone who was going to be grateful or wounded or both. She thought, he did not expect someone who remembered the date on the paper. She thought, the date is going to matter, not now, but later. In a formal context, it is the kind of fact that changes the weight of things. She had not planned to use it. She had simply held it, the way she held all accurate information, carefully, without immediate application, until the application became clear. She processed the yarrow and thought about dates and documents and the specific use of accurate information in the right moment, and she felt the particular useful clarity that came from being a person who paid attention and who could wait. She was still at the table an hour later, working through the second batch of measurements, when the door opened again without a knock. She did not turn. She was in the middle of something that required both hands, and she finished it, set the cord down, and turned. The king was in the doorway in his working clothes, the quiet dark ones he wore when he was not on official duty but not fully at rest either. He looked at the room and at her and at the table in the way she had come to recognize as his reading of the current state of things, the brief assessment he made before altering the atmosphere of any space she occupied. He said, "Dorian was here." She said, "He was." He said, "Are you all right?" She said, "I am fine." He came to the table and stood across from it and said nothing for a moment, looking at the measurement grid with an expression that was very controlled but was not, she noted, entirely flat. She said, "He told me not to get ideas." He said, "I know." She said, "You know he came here, or you know what he said?" He said, "I know the category of thing he would say. I know Dorian." He said it with the tone she had heard once before, not heated, but with the quality of a judgment that had been held carefully for some time, and was now being allowed to exist without further suppression. "I also know about the letter. Not what it said. That it existed, that it was written before the ceremony, that it was placed afterward. I know because it is consistent with how he handles things he has already decided." A brief pause. "I'm sorry for it." She said, "It doesn't matter." He said, "It matters." She said, "Not to me anymore. I put it in the fire and I kept the date, and I'm here, and the compound is going to be done on time." He looked at her with the quality of attention she still did not have a word for, full and particular and specifically directed. He said, "Dorian told you not to get ideas. I am telling you to get them. Whatever ideas you are forming about these 14 days, or about what might follow them, or about me, think them through completely. Don't cut anything short because of what he said in this room. I would rather you understood the thing fully and arrived at a no, than that you arrived at nothing because someone else interfered with the arrival." She said, "He does not govern what I think." He said, "I know." A small pause. "I wanted to say it anyway." She picked up the measuring cord. She said, "He has told the pack to watch. They were already watching. Now they're watching with a framework." He said, "I know." She said, "Whatever happens or doesn't happen between now and day 14, they will talk." He said, "I have been Alpha King for 5 years. I have been watched and talked about for every one of them. Let them talk." She said, "That is easier to say from your position." He said, "Then I am saying it from both positions. Yours and mine, both of us at the same time. Let them talk. Whatever they say about both of us, let them." She looked at him. He said, "That is not nothing, both of us." She turned back to the measurement grid. The yarrow was waiting. The second batch of measurements was half done, and needed completing before the afternoon's light changed, and she had 6 more days of work that required this specific quality of concentrated attention, and she was not going to spend it standing still in the middle of the afternoon. She said, "Day 3 of 14, I said. Check back on day 14. He said, "Day 14. Said it the way he said everything he meant and intended to be held to. He left. She worked until the light from the window was gone, and the lamp needed adjusting. She worked until the yarrow batch was finished and the next day's measurements were organized in the reference journal. On the evening of day 6, she sat in the small dining room after dinner and wrote in the reference journal, not the formula notes, those were in their own section. She wrote in the running observations section, which she kept in every extended preparation period, and which was the section she always found most useful when she came back to her notes afterward. The observations section was where she kept the things that were not yet conclusions but were moving toward them. The things that needed to be held in written form because she could not yet hold them completely in memory, without risking the distortion that memory introduced when it was not anchored to text. She wrote, Elder to Yarrow threshold recalibrated. Will improve senior group outcomes. Confirmed against Grade as records and South Pack comparison. She wrote, Age distribution provided unprompted on day 1. Preparation room maintained with correct orientation before arrival. Cave inventory understated by approximately 40%. These are not accidents. She wrote, Owen manages this household with more skill than is visible. Note for future reference. She stopped. She looked at what she had written. She thought, I am writing about the compound and about the man who arranged for the compound to be done correctly, and I am not separating those two things as cleanly as I might have expected to. She thought, that may be accurate. She thought, I should think about that. She closed the reference journal. She put it in its position in the left section of the satchel, where it always lived when it was not in active use. She sat for a moment in the small dining room with the fire and the warm food that Owen had left for her, and she was aware of the house around her. Its sounds, its warmth, the specific quality of a house that had been managed with care for 16 years. She was aware of the pendant that she did not yet have, but that was somehow already present in the way she was thinking about the days, something that had not been there before the North Wall walk, and was there now. She thought, I am going to need to be careful. She thought, not the kind of careful that is self-protective, the kind that is accurate. She thought, those are not the same thing, and I have sometimes confused them. She was not going to confuse them now. She thought, both of us. 3 times she had heard him say or imply that, in one formulation or another, across 3 separate days. It was not a person who said things without meaning them. She had had enough evidence of that to be certain. When he said a thing, the thing was what he meant, and he was not going to unsay it, and would not have said it if he had expected to need to. She thought, I know what I think. She thought, I have 8 more days to confirm it. She went to sleep. She thought, both of us. Once, briefly, deliberately, and then she put it down and went back to the work. 9 days remaining. Once, briefly, deliberately, and then she put it down and went back to the work. 9 days remaining. She counted them once and then stopped counting, because counting them was not going to make them go faster or slower, or change what they were going to be made of. Day 14 arrived the way things arrive when you have been counting toward them, all at once, with the particular quality of a thing that has always been there, and has simply allowed itself to be present. The night before it she had not slept well. This was not anxiety. She had been with herself long enough to know the difference between anxiety, which was disorganized, which scattered the attention, which made the next morning harder rather than better, and the kind of wakefulness that came from being on the verge of a significant thing and not wanting to miss any of it. She lay in the dark in the small room in the west wing that had been hers for 13 nights, and she was aware of everything. The cold at the window, the sound of the keep's nighttime, the quality of the dark, the specific weight of what tomorrow was going to be. She thought about the 14 days. She thought about day 1, the arrival in the inner courtyard, Owen with his incomplete sentences, the preparation room with its north light and its smell of old time, the man in the doorway who had gray eyes and had already arranged for the age distribution before she knew she needed it. She thought about the herb garden and the elder tree at the far wall. She thought about the dinner table and the 3 questions he asked while 8 other people arranged their silverware. She thought about the north wall and the moonlight and the plain, exact way he had said. I watched a woman stand in the center of a full pack gathering. He had not softened it. He had not shaped it into anything. He had said it the way she said things that were true, and that she was going to say regardless of how they landed. She thought about the measurement grid and the threshold calibration, and 67 sealed stone jars arranged in age group tiers. And she thought about Great at the lodge table with her observation notes and the 3 hours that had produced the best working session she could remember. She thought about the exact moment on day 3 when she had turned from the measurement grid and he had said, it was not toward Dorian. The specific quality of the stillness afterward. She had held very still, and so had he, and the preparation room had been very quiet, and the north light had been steady and unchanging, the way good light always was. She thought about the night she had stood on the south path at the edge of Blackthorn territory in the dark with the bond she had carried for 6 years, the bond that had a direction and no destination, and had understood that it had done what it was for and was finished. She thought about what it felt like to put down something you had carried for a long time, Not relief exactly. The quality of putting it down. The difference in what you felt without the weight. She thought about a man standing in a tree line with gray eyes looking at the edge of a clearing. She thought, I know what I want. This was new, not the wanting. She had been aware of the wanting in a careful, provisional way for most of the 14 days, had been aware of it and had kept it at a working distance while she assessed whether it was built on something or whether it was just the momentum of being paid close attention to by a person who was good at paying close attention. She had checked it every day the way she checked the compound ratios, looking at each component, testing the integrity of each one, not allowing the whole to proceed until the components held up. The components held up. She thought, I know what I want, and I know what I think, and I know enough. She thought, tomorrow. She had been in the preparation room since 5 in the morning. She had been there at 5 on several of the 14 days. The early hours were the ones she worked in most cleanly, when the keep was still and the north light had not yet come up and the lamps threw their steady yellow light across the stone table without interference. She had used those early hours on the last 3 days specifically to get the final stages of the compound done at the precision they required. She had finished at 7:30 the previous evening, but 5 in the morning on day 14 was for looking at what she had made, which was different from making it and required different attention. The compound was done. 67 sealed stone jars, labeled in her clear hand, arranged in the age group tiers she had specified and organized with Owen's careful cooperation over the previous afternoon. The elder to Yarrow ratio at her revised calibration, holding at the pack-specific threshold she had plotted through 12 days of measurement and one long consultation with Greta that had run past midnight by lamplight and had been one of the most productive conversations she could remember having with anyone in her professional life. The Winterberry integrated at the correct proportion. The dog rose balanced at the exact volume she had recalculated on day 9, after finding an inconsistency in the standard formula that she had suspected for 2 years but had not had sufficient working time to confirm until now. It was the best compound set she had ever produced. She did not say this aloud. She thought it once, clearly, with the honest assessment she applied to all her own work. Not prideful, not performed, simply accurate. This was exceptional work. She had done exceptional work here and she knew it. She walked the row of jars one more time in the early lamplight. She opened 2 of them and checked the color and consistency and sealed them again. She checked the label on the Tier 3 cluster, the senior group, the calibrated ones, the jars that were specific to this pack and no other. She verified the 3 labels she had been most careful about, the ones at the threshold line, where a misassignment would undo the purpose of the calibration entirely. They were correct. She thought about the compound sitting in 67 stone jars on the shelves of the preparation room, and she thought about what would happen to it over the next weeks. Owen distributing it in the precise order she had specified, the Tier 1 jars to the children's households first, the Tier 2 to the broad adult pack, the Tier 3 to the elder group with the specific instructions she had written in the clearest hand she possessed. She thought about the wolves who were going to receive those jars, most of whom she had never met, all of whom were going to have a better winter than they would have had without the calibration. She thought, I made this. She thought, it will do what I intended it to do. She thought, that is what the work is for. She thought about her mother at the kitchen table explaining, when she was very small, the purpose of the healer's compound. She had asked, why do we make it if we give it away? Her mother had said, we give it away because we make it, not the other way around. Making it is the work. The giving is the point of the work. These are not the same thing, and you need to know the difference. She had known the difference ever since. She had given 12 years of winter compounds to Marjorie, and never asked for more than the fair price. She had walked the path in every season, because the path existed, and the cottage was at the end of it, and the knowledge she had was the knowledge that was needed. She had built the formula for Marjorie's knee over 3 winters of iteration because the formula needed building, and she had the capacity to build it, and that was sufficient reason. This was the same, only the scale was different. She thought, the scale has always been trying to become this. She thought, I am ready for it. She stood in the pre-dawn lamplight with the 67 sealed jars and let herself be certain of that, fully and without qualification, for exactly long enough. Then she went to the window and looked at the sky, and waited for 7:30. Owen appeared at the preparation room door at 7:30. He had the look of a man who has been given very specific instructions about a significant event, and is doing his level best not to reveal a single detail, while also not being able to hide the fact that significant instructions exist. He said, the king requests your presence in the main courtyard at 9 o'clock. He said this, and then added approximately 4 other statements that tapered to silence before reaching their subjects. and then retreated down the stairs. She looked at the 67 jars. She went to her room and changed into the good dress she had brought with her. Not the gray wool of the ceremony. A different one. Darker and better fitted. The one she kept for occasions that warranted it, which in her life were not frequent. She rebraided her hair and pinned it properly. She put on the good coat, she checked the time, and it was 8:45, and she was ready, and she was not going to stand in her room and be ready for 15 minutes when she could be downstairs. She went down to the main courtyard at 8:53. The courtyard was full of people. This was not what she had expected. She had expected something like a formal handover, the compound acknowledged, the arrangement concluded, some administrative ceremony of completion. She had not expected the entire household assembled in the open courtyard in the cold morning air. The household staff along the north wall, the 4 counselors in their formal colors near the east passage, Greta in the chair that had been brought down from the northern lodge for the purpose. A half-day's ride, that lodge. And someone had brought the chair. The household guard in full formation around the courtyard perimeter. And scattered among these pack wolves who had been at the keep for various purposes, 30 or 40 in total, all present, all facing the center of the courtyard. She stopped at the door. The pack stopped talking. She walked to the center. She had walked to the center of a gathering before. She knew how to do it. The king was standing in the center of the courtyard, not elevated, not behind anything, not at a remove. Simply present, in the formal coat he wore for significant occasions, the mountain pine sigil at the shoulder, standing in the open space at the heart of 30-some witnesses, as if there were nowhere else he would rather stand. He was looking at her. She stopped 10 feet from him. Hilda was there. That was the next thing she took in. Hilda, from the South Pack gathering, the elder who had presided over the declaration ceremony 13 nights ago, in her carved chair that had been brought here the same way Grady's had been, with the same deliberate effort of people who were preparing something that required the right witnesses. She had the same expression she always had, the carved wood expression, the face of a woman who has been present at consequential events for 30 years and has made peace with all of them. Seraphine looked at the king. He said, 14 days. She said, yes. He said, the compound is complete. She said, it is. He said, and I have had 14 days in the same household as you. 8 o'clock mornings, shared dinners, evening walks, the particular experience of watching a person work, which I maintain tells you more about a person than most other things combined. He said this to the courtyard, addressing the gathered witnesses, but he was looking at her, not at the crowd. At her, with the crowd as witness to what existed between them specifically. I have had 14 days to be certain. I am certain. She was entirely still. He said, Seraphine Cole, keeper's daughter, healer, maker of compounds no one else could make in this territory. The bond that was declined by a lesser man is not lesser for the declining. What that man failed to see is as clear to me as anything I have known. He stopped. He let the courtyard hold the silence for exactly long enough. I know who you are. I know what you are. I am asking this now, in front of every person here, because you deserve to be asked in front of all of them. 30 people. 40. Their breath making small clouds in the cold morning air. Greta's eyes on her. Hilda's face, composed as stone. Owen, somewhere to the left, with his eyes closed in what appeared to be concentrated hope. The king said, will you have me? She looked at him. She thought, yes. She had been thinking it for 11 days, honestly. And she had held it carefully and examined it from every angle available to her over 11 days, and it had remained yes throughout. She said, yes. He took 2 steps forward and was close enough now that she could see his face with full clarity, the gray eyes and the expression that was not, today, quite as controlled as it usually was. Something had come to the surface of him that she recognized from the moment in the North Walk, the brief visible thing beneath the deliberate control. It was real, and she could see it, and she thought, he let me see it. He is letting me see it on purpose. He reached into his coat pocket and brought out a pendant on a chain. Small, old, dark metal, iron, she thought, with the mountain pine and minimal relief on the face. Small enough that you would have to hold it close to read the design. The kind of thing worn against the skin, kept private, kept close. Not an ornament, an object that meant something specific to whoever had carried it. He did not put it around her neck. He held it out in his open palm and let her choose. She took it. The chain was light in her hand. The pendant was cool and then warming in her palm. She turned it over and looked at the design and the wear of the metal and understood immediately what it had been and how long it had been carried. He said, quietly enough that it was almost not for the courtyard. My mother's. She told me to give it to the right person when I found them. I have been carrying it for 5 years. She closed her fingers around it. She said, "I will take good care of it." He said, "I know." Behind him, Hilda rose from her chair. Hilda's voice did what it always did, carried without requiring volume, landing cleanly in the center of the space. She said, "The Alpha King has declared. The bond is offered and received. The pack is witness." The courtyard moved. Not the laughter of 13 nights ago. Not the settling exhale of anticipated confirmation. This was a different sound entirely. A wave that started at the front of the gathered witnesses and moved back through all of them, low and collective and real. The sound a group of people makes when they have seen something genuine happen and know it. Seraphine stood in the center of the courtyard with the pendant in her closed hand and the morning cold on her face and the king in front of her, and she thought, this is what it is supposed to feel like. She had not known she was waiting for this feeling. She had not let herself know that because it would not have been useful to know it while she was standing at the edge of the clearing 13 nights ago, or on the south path going home through the dark. But now she knew, and it was exactly what she had been waiting for. The weight of a thing that was real, chosen with full information, handed to her in the form of a question rather than a declaration. He had asked, not declared, not assumed, asked. She had answered. She opened her palm and looked at the pendant one more time. The iron, the mountain pine, the wear of 5 years in a pocket. She looked up at him, and he was looking back, and his expression was fully present now. The thing she had been trying to name for 14 days entirely visible on his face for the first time. Relief. Not small relief. The relief of a person who has been carrying something uncertain for a very long time and has just been given permission to set it down. She understood it in her own chest, where something that had been held tightly for reasons she had not fully examined was unclenching with the same quality of relief, quiet and real. She said, 8 o'clock was a good time. He said, with the thing that was not quite humor finally all the way to the surface. I thought so too. And she fastened it herself. That was the first thing. He had placed it in her hand, open-palmed, and she had closed her fingers around it, and then opened them again. And she looked at the pendant for a long moment, with the sound of the pack behind her. That low, real, collective sound. And she brought the chain up and reached behind her own neck and clasped it. Her fingers found the clasp without hesitation. She had fastened enough necklaces in her life, her mother's and her own and the decorative ones she wore on the few occasions that required decoration, and her hands knew the motion. The pendant settled against the hollow of her throat, cool through the fabric of her dress, lighter than she expected and already warming. She lowered her hands. She looked at the king. He was looking at the pendant at her throat with an expression she had not seen on him in 14 days, not controlled, not assessed, not the professional attention or the considered quality or the waiting patience. He was simply looking, the way a person looks at a thing they have held in their pocket for 5 years and have just watched settle where it was meant to be. She said, "How does it look?" He said, "Right." Behind him, the first of the wolves had begun to kneel. She was aware of it at the periphery of her attention before she turned to see it, the change in the sound, the shift in the quality of the crowd's presence. When she turned, she found Greta already on one knee, which had required the assistance of the young household guard who stood beside her, and who was holding the back of her chair to keep it steady. Greta on one knee, her white head lowered, her hands on the cold flagged stone for balance, with the expression of a woman who has been waiting for a particular thing to happen and is relieved, after some years, that it is happening. Owen was on both knees. She had not expected that. Owen was a man of procedure and practical orientation, and she had not expected him to be the second after Greta. But there he was, on both knees in the courtyard with his eyes open now and wet, which he would probably be embarrassed about later, and which she found, in this moment, the most Owen response possible to the most unusual morning she had been part of. The counselors followed, then the household guard, then the pack wolves who had gathered from the keep and the outbuildings, each one dropping to one knee or two, the motion spreading through the assembled witnesses the way the sound had spread, starting near and moving outward, unhurried, with the quality of something that is happening because it is correct and not because it is required. Seraphine stood in the center of the courtyard with the pendant at her throat and the pack kneeling around her, and the king standing directly in front of her, and she held herself with the same straightness she had held in the clearing 13 nights ago, with the same quality of spine, and she was not going to cry in this courtyard any more than she had cried in that one. But it was different. In the clearing 13 nights ago, the straightness had been the thing that kept her intact. It had been the frame she built around what she would not give them. Here it was something else, not a frame for keeping things in, but a posture of receiving something real, of standing correctly inside a thing that was happening to her, instead of merely enduring something happening at her. She turned to look at Hilda. Hilda had not knelt. She was too old to kneel in cold morning air, and she did not pretend otherwise. But she was sitting in her carved chair with her hands in her lap, and she was looking at Seraphine with the expression that Seraphine had waited her whole life to receive from someone in this pack, and had not known she was waiting for. The expression of a person who recognizes what they are looking at, and is not surprised. Seraphine held her gaze. Hilda said, quietly, in the voice she used when she was speaking for the record, rather than for the moment, "You were always this. The clearing 13 nights ago did not make you less." Seraphine said, "No." Hilda said, "The man who wrote the letter before the ceremony." She said, "I burned the letter." Hilda said, "Good." The king had not moved. He was still standing directly in front of her, close enough that she did not have to raise her voice for what she said next to reach him and no further. He was looking at her with full attention, and he was not kneeling because that was not what this was. He had made an offer, and she had received it, which meant they were equal in it, which was the point. She said, "The compound is finished, all 67 jars. The documentation is in the reference journal on the preparation room table." He said, "I'll send Owen for it this afternoon." She said, "Owen should send someone else. He is going to need a few minutes." He looked briefly to where Owen was still on both knees in the courtyard with his eyes wet. Something moved across his face that was not quite a smile, and was warmer than anything she had seen in 14 mornings. He said, "Yes, someone else." The pack was beginning to rise, slowly, the motion reversing the way it had spread, from the outer edge inward, the outer circle of wolves coming back to their feet first, and the inner ones following. The courtyard was beginning to sound like a courtyard again, voices, the shuffle of feet on flagged stone, someone near the east passage saying something quietly to the person beside them, the ordinary sounds of a space returning to ordinary use after something extraordinary has occurred in it. She became aware that she was looking around the courtyard with the particular attention of someone taking inventory, and that she was taking inventory for a specific reason. Dorian Blackthorne was not here. She had noted this when she first walked into the courtyard, registered the absence in the first scan, set it aside because there was no room for it in what she was about to walk into. Now, with the morning settling into something that could accommodate a second thought, she returned to it. He was not here. He had not been in the courtyard for any part of it. The king was watching her. He had the quality of someone who has watched a person realize something and is waiting to see what they do with the realization. She said, "He wasn't here." He said, "No." She said, "Did he know it was today?" He said, "He knew." She said, "And?" He said, "He made a choice about where to be this morning. It was his choice to make." A pause. A particular pause, not dismissive of the subject but clear about its position. "It is a matter for tomorrow, not for now." She looked at him. She said, "All right." He said, "Today is for today." She touched the pendant at her throat. Not a gesture she had planned. It simply happened. Her hand finding it the way a hand finds something new and learns its weight. The iron was warm now. It had taken on the heat of her skin. Around them, the courtyard was all the way back to ordinary. The household staff had dispersed. The counselors were moving in conversation toward the east passage. The household guard had broken their formation, and the outer courtyard was visible again behind them, open and cold and normal. Greta was being helped to her feet by the young guard who had assisted her down, and she was accepting this with the dignified tolerance of someone who requires the help and finds the requirement inconvenient, but will not be made foolish by it. When she was upright, she looked across the courtyard at Seraphine, and she nodded once, with exactly the same unhurried approval she had nodded from her seat at the dinner table on day one. Seraphine nodded back. Owen, who had gotten to his feet at some point during the dispersal of the crowd and was now brushing at the knees of his trousers with the concentrated focus of a man who is using a practical task to manage himself, looked up and met her eyes briefly. He looked away immediately and went back to his knees with even greater concentration. But in the brief look she saw something she had not expected to find in Owen's face. Pride. Not in himself, not in the household, not in the procedure. In her. She thought, "I did not know he felt that." She thought, "I should have known." She thought, "There are things about this place and these people that I have been looking at for 14 days and have not yet seen properly, and I am going to have time to see them." The king was beside her now, not in front of her. The shift from facing each other across a space to standing in the same direction had happened quietly, between one breath and the next, and she had not tracked the transition. He said, "Owen will want to organize the compound transfer to the pack distribution points. He has a system. It is a more elaborate system than the task requires. but it produces the correct outcome. She said, then let him use his system. He said, he always does. She looked at the compound documentation. She stood in the courtyard for a long moment after Hilda finished speaking, while the pack began to rise, not all at once, the rising as organic and unhurried as the kneeling had been. Around her the morning moved back into its ordinary sounds, the sounds of a keep and a household and a winter morning, but with a different quality now. The same courtyard she had arrived in 12 days ago, the same flagged stone, the same outer wall with the same eastern gate. Different, she thought. Things change and the stones stay the same. The stones just have new information in them. Owen appeared at her elbow, not intrusive, not performing anything, simply present with the particular quality of a man who has decided what he is going to say, and is going to say it, and then go back to his work. He said, I wanted to tell you. On day 1, when you arrived, before you even unloaded your satchel, you looked at the preparation room and asked Owen what the north light was like in the afternoon. He stopped. He was not looking at her, was looking at a point somewhere past her left shoulder. I had been worried about the arrangement, whether you would find it adequate. You asked about the north light and I thought, she knows what she needs and she knows how to ask for it. Another pause. I thought that boded well. She said, Owen. He said, yes. She said, thank you. For the 16 years you have put into this household. He blinked. He said, that is, thank you. Yes. He appeared to find something important to note in his small notebook, and retreated with the efficiency of someone who has reached the limit of what he can manage with dignity, and knows it. She looked at the king. He was watching Owen's retreat with the look she had come to associate with his particular regard for Owen, which was the look of a man who is very fond of someone, and knows that saying so directly would embarrass everyone involved. She said, you appreciate him. He said, he has run this household for 16 years, and has never once suggested I find someone who might do it more simply. He paused. That is a form of loyalty I take seriously. She said, most people with that much competence want to be acknowledged for it. He said, Owen is acknowledged for it. In the ways that matter to him. He looked at her. You found the ways that mattered to him in 12 days. She said, the North Light question boded well, apparently. He said, with the full humor finally all the way visible now, no longer not quite. It boded extremely well. She looked at the compound documentation she would need to walk Owen through, and she thought about the reference journal on the preparation room table, with its careful records of every ratio and adjustment and calibration, and she thought about the 67 sealed jars and the wolves they were going to protect through a winter that would come regardless, and she felt the particular satisfaction of work that had been done correctly, and would do what it was supposed to do. She said, I need to write up the distribution instructions this afternoon. The age tiers matter. The jars have to go to the right groups or the calibration doesn't hold. He said, I'll have the preparation room kept clear for you until you're done. She said, tomorrow. He said, tomorrow what? She said, you said the matter of Dorian was for tomorrow. He said, it is. She said, then I want to be there when it happens. He looked at her. She said, what happened in that clearing 13 nights ago, and what happened this morning? I was present for both of them. I should be present for what comes between them. He said, after a moment, yes. She said, good. She reached up and touched the pendant one more time, this time deliberately, this time knowing she was doing it, and then she let her hand drop and turned toward the keep door and the stairs and the preparation room where the reference journal was and where the afternoon's work was waiting. He walked beside her. She was aware of this as they crossed the main courtyard and went up the back stairs, aware of it the way she had been aware of the pendant at her throat, not with constant attention but with a background knowing that was not intrusive and was not absent. The compound documentation was on the stone table. The reference journal was open to the last working page. The preparation room held the smell of 14 days of work, the specific combination of elder and yarrow and winterberry and dog rose that was, she supposed, the smell of this particular compound set. No other would smell exactly like this. She sat and began writing the distribution instructions, and he sat across the table, not crowding the work, not adding to it, simply present in the specific way he was present in things that required patience, and she wrote in her clear hand while the afternoon light moved through the north window. After a while he said, is the documentation complete or does it need a second day? She said, this afternoon. I write quickly when I know what I'm writing. He said, I know. She looked up. He said, you do everything quickly when you know what you're doing, and carefully when you don't yet know. I have been watching you work for 14 days. She said, I noticed. He said, I know that too. And the thing that was not quite humor was entirely at the surface for a moment, visible and warm and then composed again. She turned back to the documentation. She wrote the age tiers, the specific jars for each group, the instruction for the two-stage distribution, the note about the threshold calibration that Owen needed to understand in order to ensure the right jars went to the right people. She wrote it the way she wrote everything, with enough precision that a stranger could follow it without error, with enough clarity that Owen would not have to guess. She thought, this is also a kind of care. She thought, I have been doing this my whole life, writing it down carefully enough that the work survives the leaving, making sure the knowledge transfers, making sure the next winter is covered. She thought, that is not going to stop being true wherever I am. The pendant was warm against her throat. She kept writing. The elders convened. The elders convened the following morning. Not in the main hall and not at the formal table. In the old council chamber on the north side of the keep, which was a room that had been used for pack decisions for longer than the rest of the keep had existed, and which had the feel of it, stone that had absorbed a great deal of weight over a great many years, and which gave back that weight to anyone who sat in it. The carved wooden chairs were arranged in the traditional configuration, a circle with no head and no foot, 5 elders in the chairs, Hilda, who had come in from the South Pack, 3 council elders from the king's household, Greta, who had declined to travel back to the Northern Lodge after yesterday, and had instead accepted a room in the West Wing, without being asked, and without asking. Seraphine sat to the king's left. This was not where she had expected to sit. She had expected, or had not expected, had simply been prepared to be placed wherever she was placed. The outer edge, the observer's position, the location of the person who is present as a courtesy rather than as a participant. She had sat in that position at this pack's events before. She knew what it looked like. The king had put his hand briefly on the back of the chair to his left when they entered the chamber, and she had taken it without comment. Dorian Blackthorne was seated in the circle, between 2 of the household counselors, in his beta heir's position. He had been present when they entered the chamber and had looked at her, not at the king, at her, with an expression that she did not need to analyze carefully to understand. It was the expression of a person who has been calculating the distance between what they expected and what is currently happening, and has found the gap wider than anticipated. He looked away first. Hilda opened the council in the traditional form, the words the same every time, designed to be the same every time, because the sameness was the point. The pack acknowledged, the matter acknowledged, the witnesses named. Then Hilda set down the formalities and said, in the direct way that was her mode when formalities were done, the Alpha King has made a declaration of bonding. The council has been called because a member of the Beta household has indicated he wishes to speak to the matter. Dorian said, I wish to speak to the matter. Hilda said, speak. He said, the bond between myself and the woman the king has claimed was formally and legally declined at the gathering ceremony 6 days ago. I declined it in the presence of the full pack, in accordance with pack law, under Hilda's witness. He said it with the careful clarity of someone who has thought through their argument in advance and is presenting it as it was prepared. The king's declaration was made without waiting for the customary period of formal clearance following a declined bond. One of the counselors said, what is the substance of the concern? He said, the concern is procedural. A declined bond requires a clearance period before a new declaration can be formally recognized. The king has moved to declaration within 14 days of the declining. The standard clearance period is, Hilda said, 21 days for a standard declining, 14 days for a declining in which the bond was not mutually acknowledged. Dorian said, I acknowledge the bond. Hilda said, you acknowledged its existence. You did not acknowledge a mutual bond. A bond requires 2 acknowledgments to be mutual. The acknowledgment was yours alone. She said this without emphasis, in the same tone she used for the traditional opening words, which was the most damning possible way to say it. The clearance period for a one-sided acknowledgment is 14 days. The king's declaration was made on the morning of day 14. A silence. Dorian said, the morning of day 14. Not after the completion of the 14th day. Hilda said, the morning of day 14 is within the 14th day. The 14th day had begun. Dorian said, the strictest reading of the clearance provision would require the day to have been completed. One of the household counselors said, carefully, is there precedent for the strictest reading? Hilda said, there is precedent in both directions. The council will consider whether the spirit of the provision or the strictest reading is more applicable here. It was Greta who spoke next from her chair in the circle, in the tone she used when she was about to say the thing the room had been circling. She said, The spirit of the clearance provision is to protect a woman from being moved from one declaration to another before she has had sufficient time to determine her own position. The question for this council is whether Mistress Cole had sufficient time to determine her position. The council turned, collectively, to look at Seraphine. She said, "I had 14 days in the same household as the king, during which time I worked, and he worked beside me, and we spoke honestly, and I formed an opinion of him with full information and without interference." She kept her voice even. "I was not moved from one declaration to another. I was asked a question by a man I had spent 14 days in honest company with, and I answered it." Dorian said, "The question was asked publicly, under the kind of circumstances where refusal is." She said, "Where refusal is what, Dorian?" He stopped. She said, "The question was asked in front of witnesses. So was yours. 13 nights ago. The only difference between the two questions is that yours was already answered before it was asked, and his was not." She let that sit for a moment. "He asked me. I answered. I answered freely, and with full information. You want this council to question whether I was truly free to answer, and I am telling you that I was." Grete said, "Has the bond ever lied?" The council chamber went quiet in the way it went quiet when Grete said the thing no one else had said. Hilda said, "Clarify the question." Grete said, "The bond. The one between the king and Mistress Cole. Has it behaved as a false bond? Has anything in the 14 days suggested uncertainty, false resonance, external manipulation?" She looked around the circle. "We speak of procedural provisions as if the procedure is the truth. The bond is the truth. The procedure exists to protect the bond from being corrupted. I am asking whether there is any evidence of corruption." Silence. Dorian said, "We don't have a test for." Grete said, "We have the word of the woman who is inside it. We have the conduct of the king across 14 days in which he was observed by the full household. We have the evidence of yesterday morning, in which the king presented his declaration not as a claim but as a question, and the woman answered freely, and the pack witnessed both." She folded her hands in her lap. "I am asking whether there is any evidence that any part of what was witnessed was false. If there is evidence, present it. If there is none, the procedure has been satisfied in spirit, and the strict reading of a single provision does not override the substance." No one presented evidence. Dorian said, "There is the question of bloodline. The king's household and pack precedent require." Seraphine said, "My mother is Nora Cole. Before her, Edith Cole. Before her, Marin Cole, who served the North Pack for 30 years, and trained the seer, who trained the seer who trained Grete." She said it plainly, not as a performance. As a fact being laid on the table where it could be seen. "The bloodline that has served this pack for 3 generations is the question of bloodline you want to raise," Hilda said. "The bloodline question is not a challenge in this council. Note it." One of the household councillors noted it. There was a pause in which various people looked at various parts of the stone floor. Hilda said, "The letter." Seraphine said, "I burned it." Hilda said, "The letter that was placed under your door on the morning following the declaration ceremony, the one dated 3 days prior to the ceremony." She said, "I burned it. I can tell you its date. I can tell you its general content. I can tell you the precise quality of the language, which was the language of a formal procedural document rather than the language of a personal communication." She looked at Hilda. "It was dated 3 days before the ceremony. Whatever the provision says about the clearance period, the decision it documents was made 3 days before the ceremony began. The chamber absorbed that." Dorian said nothing. Hilda said, "If the decision to decline was made 3 days before the ceremony, then the clearance period began, at the earliest, when the decision was made, not when it was publicly announced." She said this to the council as a statement, not a question. 3 days before the ceremony, plus 14 days of clearance, places the end of the clearance period at 11 days after the ceremony. The king's declaration was made on day 14 after the ceremony. The provision is satisfied under either calculation. Dorian said, "The clearance period is typically counted from the ceremony." Hilda said, "The clearance period is counted from the declining. You have now told this council, through the evidence of the letter, that the declining occurred 3 days before the ceremony. The letter is the record." She looked at him. "You created the record, Dorian. You dated it." A very long silence. One of the household councillors said, "Is there further matter to be addressed?" No one said anything. Hilda said, "The council finds the king's declaration procedurally and substantively valid. The bond is recognized. The objection is noted and dismissed." She said it in the traditional tone of finality, which left no room for anything to attach to it. "The matter is concluded." Dorian stood. He did it correctly. with the posture of a man who has been in councils before and knows how to leave one with his face intact. He nodded to Hilda, nodded to the council, and walked toward the door with his shoulders back and his chin level. At the door he stopped. He did not turn around completely. He turned enough that his profile was visible, which meant he was speaking to the room and not to any person in it specifically. He said, "She'll do right by the king. I'll say that." He said it with the tone of a man who has nothing left to give and is giving the smallest thing available. She always does right by whatever she undertakes. Then he left. The door closed. The council chamber was very quiet. Greta said, "He is not entirely without redeeming qualities. He simply has them in the wrong order." Hilda said, "We note that and move to conclusion." The conclusion was brief and formal, and completed the record correctly. Seraphine sat through it with her hands in her lap and the pendant at her throat, and the particular quality of a person who has been through something that required everything, and is now sitting very quietly on the other side of it. The king beside her said nothing during the conclusion. He had said almost nothing during the full council, which she had noticed. He had let her speak. He had let her arguments stand. He had not filled her silences or corrected her approaches or offered the weight of his position as a substitute for the substance of what she was saying. He had sat beside her and let her be the person conducting her own case. When the council formally ended and the elders rose, she said to him, quietly, "Thank you for letting me speak." He said, "It was your matter to speak. I am not going to speak on your behalf when you are present and capable, and have more relevant information than I do." She said, "That is also an unusually direct thing." He said, "I find directness saves everyone a great deal of time." She said, "It does." She thought about Dorian on her way back up to the preparation room. Not with the heat of it. The heat was spent, had burned clean in the council chamber the way the letter had burned clean in the kitchen fire, completely, and without leaving anything she had to manage. She thought about him the way she thought about compounds that had done their work, accurately, without sentiment, with the clear assessment of someone who looks at what a thing actually was rather than what she had needed it to be. He had been the direction she was given at 16. He had been the direction of a bond she had not chosen and could not control the pointing of, and the direction had not been a lie. She had felt it. It had been real. It had been accurate about the presence of a genuine connection between two people. What the bond had not been accurate about was what that connection would produce when examined against the character of the man on the other end of it. Bonds, she thought, measured connection. They did not measure character. She had spent 6 years waiting for a man she had a bond with. She had found out, at the end of those 6 years, that connection was not the same as compatibility, that the direction had been real and the destination had been wrong, and that the bond had served its function by pointing the direction, even if the direction led nowhere she could have been. She thought about a compass. A compass told you which way was north. It did not tell you whether north was where you needed to go. Her north had been elsewhere. She had needed the 6 years to know that. She was not glad they had been 6 years of waiting. She would not say that. She was glad, now that she was on the other side of them, that she had waited with the quality she had waited with, that she had not settled, had not forced the destination, had not decided that the direction was what she needed, even when the direction was all she had. She had lived her life at the South Edge, fully and practically, and with the completeness of someone who is not waiting for their life to begin, but is living it in the space available. And when the space changed, she had been ready, because she had been present. She thought, that is the correct way to wait for something. She thought, I learned it from my mother. She thought about Nora Cole at the kitchen table, going about her work with the fire banked and the herbs in their rows, and the particular quality of a woman who had lived her whole life at the south edge of a territory, and had never for a single day of that life behaved as if the south edge was insufficient. She thought, I am my mother's daughter. She thought, I am also something my mother was not, which is someone who is going somewhere else, and I am ready for that because of her, because of the quality she had and passed to me without instruction, which was the quality of being entirely sufficient to wherever you were. You did not need the center to be sufficient. The edge was not lesser. The center was simply different. She reached the preparation room. She opened the door. The north light was the same north light it had always been, steady, honest, indifferent to what had happened in the council chamber that morning, or the courtyard the previous day, or the clearing 13 nights ago. The light was just the light. It did what it always did, showed the work clearly. She sat down at the stone table and put her hands flat on the surface of it. She thought, I did good work at this table. She thought, I am going to go on doing good work. She sat in the good north light and breathed and let the morning settle into the afternoon and let the afternoon be what it was, which was the beginning of the rest of it. and when the afternoon asked her to begin, she began. She stood. She was ready for the afternoon. She had distribution instructions to complete and work to do and a new circumstance to begin understanding properly. She was ready to begin it. The preparations to leave took 4 days. This was longer than the compound had taken, which was not because the leaving was more complicated than the compound, but because leaving a place properly, in the way that does not leave things undone or unsaid, was different work than technical work. Technical work had a sequence and a completion point. This kind of work had more edges. She spent the first of the 4 days writing out the full distribution protocol for the compound in a clean version for the household records, cross-referenced against the reference journal and organized in the order Owen would need to follow it. She spent part of the afternoon teaching Owen the critical points directly, walking him through the age tiers and the specific jars for each group, and the instructions for the 2-stage distribution that would get the compound to the outlying pack households before the deep cold. Owen took notes with a very small notebook and a very focused expression, and asked better questions than she expected him to ask. She told him so. He said, "I have been managing this household for 16 years, Mistress Cole. I simply don't always show my work." She said, "You should show your work more often." He said, "I will consider that," and wrote something in his notebook that she could not read and suspected was not related to the compound. On the second day she packed. This was quicker than the distribution protocol and took about an hour, because she had packed with efficiency and she had not accumulated anything during the 14 days that was not already hers. The stone mortar went back into the satchel, the knife roll, the reference journal with its new pages added, the good dress, the working clothes, the boots she had worn every day and which had handled the garden mud and the stone floor and the flagged courtyard with the same reliability they always did. She looked around the preparation room before she closed the door. The stone table was clear. The iron hooks were empty. The north light came through the open shutter the same way it had come through every morning for 14 days. Steady, gray. The room smelled of herbs now, the accumulated scent of 14 days of work, which was a better smell than the dust and old time she had found when she arrived. She thought, "I did good work in this room." She closed the door. On the third day she went to Greta. The seer was in her guest room in the west wing, which was a small room with a south-facing window and a chair positioned directly in the light from it, where Greta was sitting when Seraphine knocked. She waved her in without looking up from the thing she was reading and said, "Sit. I'll finish this sentence." She sat in the chair across from the window and waited. Greta finished the sentence. She set the page down and looked at Seraphine with the direct attention that was the only mode she operated in. She said, "You have a question." Seraphine said, "I have several." Grady said, "Start with the one that has been the most difficult to hold." She said, "The bond. What he said in the courtyard yesterday, that the bond that was declined by a lesser man is not lesser for the declining. But I felt the first bond. At 16, it was real." Grady said, "It was real." She said, "And yet," Grady said, "a bond is a direction, not a destination. It tells you the road, not what you will find on it, or whether the road is the one you should take. Dorian was the direction the bond pointed when you were 16. The bond was accurate about the connection. It had no information about the character of the man on the other end of it, because character is not what bonds measure." She said, "And the king?" Grady said, "Is a direction that points more truly. In both directions." She held Seraphine's gaze. "He has had a bond since he was 24. He did not tell you this?" She said, "No." Grady said, "He has been waiting 7 years, not for you specifically, for whoever was at the other end of it to be findable." A pause. "When he came to the ceremony, it was because the bond pulled him there. He did not know why until he saw you at the edge of the clearing." Seraphine sat with that for a moment. She said, "He's been carrying that pendant for 5 years." Greta said, "His mother died 5 years ago. She gave it to him and told him he would know when." A pause. "He is a man who trusts things he knows. He had to be certain before he moved." She said, 14 days. Greta said, "He is also a man who, once he knows, does not waste time." She sat with that too. She said, "I'm leaving tomorrow." Grady said, "I know." She said, "I'm going back to the cottage first, to my mother, to pack what needs packing and say what needs saying, and close things in the way they need to be closed." Grady said, "And then?" She said, "And then I'll come back." Grate said, "Yes," as if this were simply what happened next and she had always known it. She said, "Is there anything I should know that I haven't thought to ask?" Grate was quiet for a moment, looking at her steadily. She said, "You have been the edge of things your whole life, the edge of the territory, the edge of the clearing, the edge of the pack's attention. You are going to have to learn how to be the center. It will feel wrong at first. The center always feels too visible to people who have learned to work from the edges. A pause. You will learn it. You have been learning it in smaller ways every day of your life. It is the same skill, on a larger stage. She said, that is not very comforting. Grayway said, I am a seer, not a comfort provider. And then, with the warm dryness that lived behind her seer's manner, but for what it's worth, you have exactly the spine for it. She thanked Greta and went back down the west corridor and out to the courtyard where the horses were being prepared for the next morning. She stood in the courtyard for a moment. The horses were the same ones from 3 weeks ago, the exceptional one, responsive and well-kept, and the 4 supply horses that had made the journey with her materials. The young rider who had knocked at her cottage door was overseeing the loading with the focused competence she had noticed in him on the journey here. Specific, unhurried, doing the thing correctly the first time. She watched him work. She thought about the 18-year-old version of herself who had come home from the Valley Market the first year she had set up her own compound table, separate from her mother's, and had sold 23 jars and had considered this an extraordinary result and had thought, this is what the work is for. The selling, the exchange, the confirmation that what she made was worth making. She thought now, that was the smallest version of the work's purpose I was ever going to encounter, and it was good that I didn't know that yet, because you needed to be able to work in a small room, with a small audience, and care about it completely, before you could do it in a larger one. She thought, I worked in the small room for 6 years. She thought, I know what the work is now. She thought about the 67 jars and their age group tiers, about Marjorie with 12 winters left if the compound held, about the threshold calibration that was this pack's own, that had never been calculated for them before, that would be calculated for them every winter now in whatever form that took, because the knowledge existed, and the knowledge did not stop existing once she left. She had written it down. Owen had it. The reference journal had it. She thought, the work survives the leaving. That is the point. She went to check the supply loading and to tell the rider what the weight distribution should be for the return journey, and he listened with the attention of someone who already had it mostly right and wanted to confirm the details, which was exactly what she needed him to be. She said, you load well. He said, my first supply run, I dropped a crate of winterberry on the pass. The rider in front of me caught it. He paused. I haven't dropped anything since. She said, that is a good way to learn. He said, it was cold. She said, yes, it tends to be, on the pass. He grinned, the brief, pleased grin of someone who has been taken seriously in a moment they didn't expect it, and went back to the loading. She went inside to finish packing the last of her things. On the 4th day she said goodbye to her mother. The cottage at the bend of the south path was as it always was. Lamp on, fire banked properly for the afternoon, the herb bundles in their rows, the good chair with the shawl. Nora Cole opened the door before Seraphine knocked, which she had always done, having always known somehow when her daughter was on the path. She made tea. They sat at the kitchen table where the letter had been 3 weeks ago, and she told her mother everything. Not the procedural version, not the edited version, the full version. From the gray eyes and the tree line to the pendant at her throat to the council chamber and what was said in it. She told it in order, without interrupting herself, and her mother listened with the focused patience of someone who has been waiting for exactly this conversation. When she was done, her mother sat for a moment with her cup, then she said, he asked. She said, yes. Her mother said, in front of everyone. She said, yes. Her mother said, good, and drank her tea. She spent the afternoon helping her mother prepare the cottage for an absence that had no fixed end, not closing it. Her mother was staying, would always stay. The cottage was her mother's life as much as her life, and she would not uproot that for anything, but preparing it for the change. Different arrangements for the compound work during the winter. The contacts in the Valley Market for the materials she usually sourced herself. Which of the pack's people would come to her mother for medicines and which would need to be told to go to the Valley Healer now. Practical things. The kind of things that mattered, and that she was good at, and that doing gave her something to do with her hands while the afternoon moved. That evening Marjorie came. She did not send word. She simply appeared at the cottage door at the 6th hour. Marjorie, who had been receiving Seraphine's compound for her knee every winter for 12 years, who was 63 and walked with the careful gait of someone who had learned to manage chronic pain, and had made the management look almost natural. She knocked, and when the door opened she looked at Seraphine for a long moment. Then she said, 12 years you've walked that path in the winter. Seraphine said, yes. Marjorie said, you should have charged more. Seraphine said, you were never going to pay more. Marjorie said, true. She stood there on the path in the cold evening with her coat on, and her careful walk, and her expression of a woman who has thought about what she is going to say, and is going to say it now. She said, "What happened in that clearing was not right. What happened with the letter was not right. What happened yesterday in the courtyard." She stopped. She said, "That was right. I want you to know someone from this pack is saying so to your face." Seraphine said, "Marjorie." Marjorie said, "I have 12 more winters in me if the compound holds. I want whoever makes it to know I said that." She said, "The instructions are written. My mother knows them." Marjorie said, "I know she does. I'm saying it to you." She reached out and took Seraphine's hand in both of hers, which was not a gesture Marjorie made. She was not a woman who made easy gestures of that kind, which made it worth more, and held it for a moment. "Go on then. Do what comes next." She said, "I will." The morning of the 5th day she rose before dawn and dressed and carried her packed satchel down to the courtyard where the king's horses were ready, and the young rider who had knocked on her door 3 weeks ago was in his position, and the supply cart was loaded with the things the household was sending back with her for the transition. She stood in the courtyard in the early dark and looked at the south path that led to the territory's edge, and the cottage, and her mother, and she held in her mind the last image she had of her mother from the previous evening, standing in the cottage doorway with the lamplight behind her. Not watching Seraphine go, but watching the path, watching what was ahead, the way she had always watched. Not afraid of it, just watching. She turned and mounted her horse. The king was already mounted beside her, which she had not heard happen. He was in his riding coat and he was looking not at her but at the road north. The road that left the Blackthorn territory and eventually reached the king's lands. The road she had never traveled. The road that was the next thing. She said, "Are you coming all the way?" He said, "Yes." She said, "The whole road." He said, "The whole road." She took the reins. The horse was the same one from 3 weeks ago, the exceptional one, responsive and calm, the one that had cost more than her cottage. She suspected this was not coincidence. She did not look back. The road ahead was long and cold and clear, and it went north, and she knew nothing about it except the quality of the man riding beside her, which she had had 14 days to determine, and had determined as accurately as she determined anything. The pack came out to see them off. That was the thing she had not expected, the household wolves and the courtyard staff and the people who had been at the gathering in the keep for various reasons, all present in the gray morning light on both sides of the road as it left the outer gate, not in formal lines, not arranged for ceremony, just there, standing in the cold in their everyday clothes, watching. No one laughed. No one said naturally. They stood and they watched in the particular silence of people who are witnessing something that will be different from this morning on, and the silence was not the silence of the ceremony clearing 13 nights ago. That silence had been the sound of expectation confirmed, of something prepared for and now delivered, of collective relief that an anticipation had finally resolved. This was the silence of people watching something begin. She rode through it with her spine straight and her hands steady on the reins and the pendant at her throat and the king at her left, and the road ahead was very long and very cold and she was entirely ready for it. She thought, "I have been the edge my whole life." She thought, "I know how to be the edge." She thought, "Let's find out what the center is made of." The road turned north. The keep fell behind. The morning opened up around them, the sky very gray and very wide, the land on either side bare and winter-stripped and honest, the cold air bringing with it the smell of the North Ridge and what would come off it, and the season that was ahead, and the one after that. She rode. The pendant was warm against her throat. The road went on.